Good morning. This is the Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Today we have a special show on the occasion of the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was born on January the 15th, 1929. So today, January 15th, is the date of his birthday. He was born at 501 Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. So this show today will be addressing that topic. Before getting into the show, I wanted to note a few events that have been occurring, one in particular that it's important for us to address. And from now on this show, in the introduction, I'm going to have some news clips on current events. And this particular event is the appearance of President Biden in Atlanta to address the issue of Black voter rights. And what was interesting about that meeting was that a number of voting rights activists, Black voting rights activists, did not attend, a number did. Stacey Abrams didn't attend, for example. And the reason was that they're angry with Biden over having placed voter rights in a secondary position while he was pushing his two bills, the bipartisan one on infrastructure that passed, and the other bill that failed. So I think, number one, this indicated that he thought that if he had a big win, it would lift everything up, and that would carry him a long way and maybe enable him to pass voter rights. Biden has been in the way of voter rights for the particular reason that he has long adhered to the filibuster rule because he's an old man of the Senate, and the filibuster has been usually used to block issues, especially those that affect Black rights. The Republicans, on the other hand, have been more than willing to waive the filibuster when they had a budget bill or anything else they wanted to pass. But it took Biden a long time to finally reach the point where, under certain circumstances, he would waive the filibuster, one being the issue of voter rights. And the thing about waiving the filibuster is that it can stop this rule that requires a 60 vote rule for something to pass, and also stop people from really holding things up through a filibuster. So after his last maneuver around his nearly $2 trillion bill got sidelined by two Democrats, then he decides to take a stand on this at a time in which he knows he doesn't have the votes. So this is an example of where Blacks put someone in office, and when they get in there, they've got priorities that put us in second place. He was going to have a difficult time with this anyway because of the need for a united front among the Democrats, and he had two defectors. But I argue he had a better chance to do this at the beginning of his term when he could have run through voter rights first and then his infrastructure, and I think he was mistaken in bringing the Republicans on board because you give them the opportunity to claim a partial victory. So that's something that we should note and keep an eye on, because if the voter rights issue is not resolved through federal legislation, then the federal government's going to have no response to the disenfranchisement of a whole lot of black and brown voters and young white voters who have been disenfranchised through various measures that we discussed last week in discussing the January 6th insurrection, the second post-Reconstruction. And this is relevant because this issue of voter registration was one of the signature gains of the Southern Freedom Movement, and particularly of the Selma to Montgomery march that King led. So this is a piece. We'll be doing more of this in subsequent um, discussions, reviews of some things that are coming up that are of topical interest. So today, for the third time, we have as our guest the esteemed scholar, Professor Manu Ampim. Brother Manu, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, brother Oba.
For your information, Brother Manu has lost his mother, a beautiful lady, and he's been taking care of her. And this is hard on you, I know. And I would have understood it if you couldn't do this show. So I really thank you for that. But we want to extend our condolences to you personally and from this show for the loss of the most valuable thing any human can lose, your mother. Your father's rough, your mother's rougher. You know what I mean? Because of the whole relationship of motherhood to us. So I'm really sorry, brother. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's kind of rough, brother.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. Well, one thing about Manu is that he has had two beautiful parents, mother and a father. What's your mother's name?
Rosie Jones.
I want to
And
dedicate.
yeah,
I want
sorry.
to dedicate this show to Sister Rosie Jones and really praise her for being a good black woman and for the work she did in helping to produce Brother Manu along with his daddy, who I personally know. So you know what I mean? And so whatever comes out of his mouth is going to be an extension of hers and his, and he's taking it to another level. And it's real good when you have parents that appreciate you when you're on the freedom road. You know what I mean? Because some will just appreciate you because you're their child, but when they see what you're doing and really appreciate it, that makes it more rewarding. So I'm really sorry. I know that's rough. You
Yeah, I appreciate it. I was telling brother T'Shaka that I wanted to just take the day off and just kind of rest. It's been rough, but I couldn't because my mother, she said, "Got to continue your work." So this definitely dedicated to her.
right on, brother. Right on. So as usual, when we bring on Brother Manu, then we get something real special because he is the foremost authority on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I say that based on being a movement activist and a scholar and being familiar with the literature on King and being familiar with him as an activist close up. And you're the only scholar that has done the job of pointing out that Martin Luther King was a revolutionary. All of them muddy that. Don't deal with that. And the mainstream scholars don't for a reason because they're getting paid by the people that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, at the end of his life, concluded the last 4 years or so that needed to be overthrown. So if you're going to put out a biography on King that places an emphasis on that, because that was from 65 to 68, his orientation, and he was thinking that he was anti-capitalist, you're going to point out later, for a long time before that, even as a student. Um, so there are reasons why that has been ignored, especially with the white scholars and any mainstream black scholars, even some who were published by blacks who did not want to lose the sponsorship of whites. So it's not only insightful that you pointed this out, and this was the key orientation of our last show, but that you had the guts to do it, and you did the outstanding research that really showed it. And I have right here the copy that you sent me of your manuscript. Uh, this is Brother Manu Ampim's manuscript that was the basis for his Masters of Arts. This is 1989. He sent this to me in 1989, and I read it. But this last week, I read it again because I'm not coming into a show with a heavyweight like this unprepared. You know what I mean? And it's entitled "The Revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr." And it says this: the thesis submitted to the faculty of the School of Graduate Studies of Morgan State University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Masters of Arts, 1989. Now, I should point out, most master's theses ain't this thick. In fact, most PhD dissertations aren't. In fact, what passes as PhD dissertations and master's theses should be put in the garbage can in most cases. Something that somebody throws away. It's fluff. But this brother here did solid research. So it's a special pleasure because I got a master on, that's number one, of the subject. And it's also special because Manu is an activist scholar. So he uses his scholarship to uplift his community. And he's not just a scholar on King, but on Africa. Why don't you talk about some of the work that you've done and are doing in the area of African studies?
I appreciate the intro, Brother T'Shaka. So yeah, my work actually spans to the 80s, the mid 80s, and that master's thesis was a culmination of my learning and applying primary or firsthand research. So I decided to use the training, the tools and techniques I learned in firsthand research methods to go beyond just the Black experience in the U.S. and use and choose a soft topic. I decided to, if I was going to spend time to do a master's thesis, why not have an impact and really challenge the prevailing thinking and so-called scholarship. But I've gone beyond that to really embrace Africa. So my work really has been in about 24 countries doing original research in museums, institutes, libraries, and then in the field at pyramid sites, temple sites, tomb sites, and ancient residential sites to reconstruct the African historical experience and really to look at the principles and practices that allowed Africans to be great. And it's not to go back and build pyramids in California or Chicago, but it's to use those principles that allowed Africans to build the mighty structures and apply them to solving practical problems today. So my work has been independent for decades now, and it's taken me to dozens of countries to do the original work because we have to recover from historical amnesia, and the work is without grants, without fellowships, and without waiting on somebody else to give an okay or an endorsement. So there's no benefactors, white benefactors, or anybody else. This is the work that I've been called to do, and I do honor my mother and father and thank them for giving me a foundation. And so I'm a researcher by trade, but I thought about it that it's the foundation. I remember asking my mother questions, and she would always have the same response: "Mom, how do you spell such and such? Look it up." That was always her response: "Look it up." And that's what I do professionally. I look it up. And going through, she just passed, so it's been tough, but this is in her honor. And going through all the records, she threw away nothing. She was an archivist, a historian, and just kept papers that didn't seem to have any relevance: tax reports, tax returns, income statements, letters, issues that have already been resolved, old insurance papers. I learned about the family history because she didn't throw anything away. So I had an example and didn't even know it. So, and so I really learned from the parents, but I also learned from the example of King, that King did not choose the mission chose him. And I began to understand that in my own life, that I didn't know. If you asked me in my early 20s, what would I be doing? Didn't know. But in short time, when I began to embrace African philosophy, my father gave me some life-saving books to read, and it really changed my outlook and my view. And I have been on a track ever since to do everything I can to help us to progress as a community. So there's nothing more significant than doing, to me, primary or first-hand research in the field of Africana studies, and that's been my mission now since the 1980s.
Yeah, I think that the path you've taken is the path that independent Black scholarship takes. Chancellor Williams, John
Yes.
Henry Clark, Doc Ben, John Jackson, none of them, Jacob Carruthers,
Mm,
um, none of them were financed by any grants, any foundations, any publishing houses. They put out their own stuff. And I would say to people, the best stuff you're going to get, Black or white, usually comes that way, because the stuff that usually comes out of the white publishing houses is censored. Even if it's good, it's the good for them. And good for you too, but it isn't threatening.
mm,
So even with white scholarship, when you see real good radical white scholarship, it's usually independently published.
mm,
But with Blacks, that's been the key. And it means that what you're saying has been unfiltered. That's my approach. And in your case, what you're talking about is the car and destiny. Some people know their car. In fact, I've said this before. There's two types of people on the question of destiny: those that know and those that find out.
right.
You and me are in the ones that found out. And King was in it in a big way. In fact, when he found out what his mission was, that could be an oh shit moment, because for us, we look at it and say, oh my, isn't that something? But when you have the burden dropped on you, you're not looking for it, and you're thinking solely of service, and it's in another direction, and then you see your whole life is going somewhere else, and you know the implications, because King was no dummy, then you are bound to have some reservations, because your life's going to be on the line with this. It's the rest of your life. So this car thing, when you're doing what you were born to do, that's the joy of life, that's the reward of life, and that's the path you're on. And I'd say that one of the keys to your work is meticulous research. And your research is good, and your primary sources, but it's your love for your people. You're out there, you're a fighter on the intellectual field, and you're always doing stuff in the community. A lot of people that don't know Manu don't know this, but he's available constantly for sharing information in the community, and then of course going to firsthand sites in Africa. So that's important. So what you're getting here is unfiltered. Now, in writing about King, what is it that led you to take this as your first project? Why King?
Well, my grad school advisor at Morgan State University told us that a few of us working on our master's thesis, and I was the first group in the graduate program in history, specializing in Africana studies. She told us to choose a project that was doable. So you don't want to choose a project that's going to take you where you have to go around the country and do things that are not practical. So choose something that's doable that you can do in our library. So I said, well, why not choose something that everybody has an opinion about? And that's Dr. King. And so I said, you know what? I know we have a lot of materials at our SOPR library at Morgan State, but I wanted to go beyond that. I was in Baltimore. I figured I can go to the FBI headquarters in DC on my own dime and spend hundreds and hundreds of hours. Then things came up where they needed somebody to help recruit students for Morgan State down at the Atlanta University Center in Atlanta. And I said, you know what? I volunteer, because that allowed me to go to the King Center and do research. And I spent my own time to go to the Muger collection up at Boston University, because I figured that it was important, because I had received some materials on King. I heard a tape of King in 1967 when the hot coals and the fire hit his lips, and then I had a book called A Testament of Hope, edited by James Washington. And when I read those essays, those articles, those interviews, excerpts from his book, this was a completely different King than I and most other people had heard. So I figured that why spend months and months and months on a project that would have a Mickey Mouse, outcome? I said I wanted to choose something that would impact the understanding of one of the greatest men in the history of the U.S. and not do as Brother Shaka had said, produce a paper thin project that doesn't mean anything. Yeah, you met the requirements, but you met it at a low level. I wanted to make an impact for the ages, and that's why I put my best into the project at the time. Much more extensive than what anybody else had done. That I was aware of in the Morgan State environment, and I spent, my time, my money, my energy. But it wasn't about that. It was about making an impact, and I figured that that was part of my mission and my duty is to challenge the prevailing thinking on Dr. King. Now I'm very clear that he's the most misunderstood and misrepresented figure in the history of the country. And so that graduate experience was for me to really hone my skills of learning the theory to now applying it to one of a project related to one of the greatest men and greatest activists of our time. So that's how it came about. It was just me wanting to take my work seriously and really make an impact because I was influenced by those men that you mentioned, by Clark, by Ben, and the greatest influence was Chancellor Williams, who was a researcher's researcher.
And who liked to put some activism into his research. He had programs that he suggested at the end of his books and stuff like that. And at his age, was honest enough to thank the Black student generation, the Black freedom movement generation, the Black power generation for doing the work we did that helped him as he helped us in terms of raising our consciousness. So there's that. And in fact, I didn't think about it, but I have a picture I chaired. You probably know the Pan-African Secretariat in the 70s. It was an extension of the Pan-African People's Organization, which still operates. It's an outgrowth of San Francisco C.O.R.E. And we had a series of conferences called the State of the Race Conferences. And a brother named C.O.R.E, who's passed on recently, who was a journalist, after I'd called the first national conference, he came up with the idea of calling this the State of the Race Conference. And that generated thousands of participants, including John Henry Clark, Doc Ben, Minister Louis Farrakhan, who was primed by Khalid Muhammad for Afrocentrism and gave an Afrocentric speech. And Khalid helped finance that particular conference in LA because he was then a part of the Typographical Research Center, as well as being a minister in the Nation of Islam. So I have a picture, and it's a picture that I'm in, and my best friend, Kehinde Solawazi, who you spoke at Fresno Junior College, who had an Afrocentric department at the junior college level, who's an outstanding scholar, artist, and human being. And so it's a picture with me and him, his wife, other members of Pan-African People's Organization, Chancellor Williams, Queen Mother Moore, May Mallory. And for people that don't know it, May Mallory was a radical sister who was close to Robert Williams in the armed self-defense movement and was active in the National Black United Front when we first organized it. So that's a classic picture. And I've got a book that I'm writing that they'll be in it, and then I've got a guy named Ron Phillips in there. He's the person that made the most significant speech at the Sixth Pan-African Congress coming from the United Kingdom, where he pointed out between class and race is primary. He was an engineer from Guyana. He's in the picture. And in fact, I've been looking at that picture and figuring out who more and more of these people are. But Chancellor Williams, with his briefcase right in front of him, that was beautiful. You know what I mean? That was a bad brother. Bad. And his best work, I want to stress again, is Rebirth of African Civilization. Destruction's important, but Rebirth is the absolutely best work. They're both classics. Chancellor Williams. Now, this show today, shouldn't be confused with the last two shows. They were on the revolutionary Martin Luther King and the assassination of Martin Luther King, both where Brother Manu brought in his insights. But this one is a different show. This show doesn't repeat itself. It might have continuation, but it's not repeating itself. And so the topic of this show is the real Dr. Martin Luther King. So what's different about this show and the previous shows is that in portraying King, almost all scholars have come up with a view of King that King wouldn't recognize if he was alive. There's an old saying in Africa that the animals will not say of the living lion what they'll say of the dead lion. When the lion is dead, they can say whatever they want. But when that lion is alive, they shut up. They don't want to get eaten up. And that was a way with King. You know what I mean? Yeah, so people were trying to distort his legacy while he was alive, but they really couldn't do it because here was the action right there. Here was the person right there. But when he's dead, then you've got all these versions. The same with Malcolm and with others. King left a trail, not only in activism, but in writing and in speaking. But it's largely ignored. Taylor Branch, these people get Pulitzer Prizes for what? They regurgitated a lot of facts people already knew, but then they distort the legacy. So this show is entitled The Real Dr. Martin Luther King. It's different from the one on the revolutionary because that is a part of what makes him real, but that was covered fairly well. We'll visit it towards the end, but that's not the primary focus of this show. This is to get the real perspective on who King was, and the distortions are great. Notice Manu said that he believes he's the most distorted person when it comes to their legacy and the history of this country. And that's a pretty big statement to make. His legacy was definitely distorted, and sometimes by people who knew him very well and knew better too. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So we're going to look at King's activist career in a totality, but, abbreviated. And so the discussion we're going to have today is going to bring in two perspectives. Manu's from his research and work, and mine from my activism in both the San Francisco freedom movement, which is primary. That's my main basis for activism for this period. I've been involved in stuff for 61 years. And my involvement in the Selma to Montgomery March, where I was a march marshal, and in the Southern movement, working with the Deacons for Self-Defense and other groups. But my main activism was in San Francisco. So my perspective, when you get this, I'll be drawn from my own intellectual perspective, but it will be also from the perspective of the San Francisco freedom movement, and you'll see why in a minute. So before getting into this discussion, I wanted Brother Cinnabar, who is a cinematographer, who's going to do some cinematography work if he is connected. I wanted him to hook up some stuff on King, which will be just a little brief summary of some of King's.
But Bob, due to time constraints, can we pass over that part with all due respect? And can we? I just have something come up for me. I'm double booked right now. Please forgive me.
Okay. So we won't have that. So without doing analysis of the topics, what I'd like you to do, Manu, is just to list categories, not going into the specifics of the topic, categories where King's legacy has been distorted. And we'll get into the specifics as we get into the discussion. What are some of the categories?
Well, one obvious category is the constant description of him as a civil rights leader. This is a gross distortion, particularly after 65. Another category, which is a gross distortion of Dr. King's work and legacy, is describing him as an integrationist. This is far from his actual activity. And also, another category of great distortion is to present King as a pacifist, somebody who is unalterably committed to nonviolence. This is certainly incorrect and inconsistent with the record. And so, also that Dr. King was simply focused on the dream when he constantly talked about a nightmare and the American reality. So these are some, broad categories that clearly indicate that King is greatly distorted, and it's not hard to figure out why he's distorted. Most people have not read a single word by Dr. King. Most people, and another area of distortions, and you mentioned part of it is people deliberately writing to misrepresent his record. So there's a whole category, I would say, of misrepresentation on the written records, whether it's Pulitzer Prize winning work or somebody else writing his quote unquote autobiography. How can hell can someone write somebody else's self story? But yet we have people conspired to write not a selected biography or so called authorized biography, but an autobiography of Dr. King. So the whole category of writings about him have been really shameful for people in scholarship and academia who know better, who know academic standards, but will still engage in the great and conscious distortion of Dr. King's work and legacy. So those are some of the categories that are quite obvious, that have to be addressed. And did I say civil rights as well? Because
Yeah, you said that.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would say also, and I know you already know this, portraying him as just fundamentally a moral persuasionist. And while there's some truth in the beginning of his career with that, even at the beginning, he's more than that. But later, he sees through that. So that's one. And then one I know you're also familiar with, treating him as a national figure who, other than the Vietnam War, really had no global connection, particularly with Africa, as you touched on in your discussion when we dealt with the revolutionary Martin Luther King. And we'll get into it again with one of these questions. So those are at least some of them. And there are others. So these are categories of distortion. So getting into the first one, and this is one that King did a little bit to contribute to some confusion on. Malcolm did a lot. I ain't knocking Malcolm, but Malcolm did a lot to distort this image because Malcolm was one, and many nationalists portrayed King as an integrationist. You know what I mean? King used the term himself, so we need to get into that too. But in the sixfold stages to mental freedom, myself and Dr. Brother Vulanlela Wabogo, we tracked the awakening process, and it coincides with African American culture. And so the two phases that are distinct, people usually start in one or the other, though it's not all one or the other, it's largely one or the other. And so one is the phase of integration, where someone is ingrained in white culture, white thought, and white identity. Malcolm located himself there. He said that when he was a prisoner, he didn't even want to associate with black prisoners. He said, now he exaggerated some stuff, but it wasn't as bad as he made it out to be. But he did locate himself there correctly, and no one else in his family fit that but him. So that's interesting. You know what I mean? That's a discussion for another time. And then he moved beyond that, obviously. We wouldn't be talking about him if he hadn't. So in the six-fold stages to mental freedom, there are two stages of identities. Some of, it describes where some Black folks are in one and some are in the other, even though there's a little bit of a mixture of both. It's basically, it's either integration or Black identity. And Black identity, which was called Negro identity at one point, colored identity at another point, you know what I mean? And we can call it African American identity right now. I call it New African, you know what I mean? Because of the mixture of African culture and New African culture and the formulation of African American culture. But there are these two distinct stages, largely. We had a little bit of a discussion of this when we did the thing on King the Revolutionary, but we didn't go into it where we're going to go into it right now. So I'm going to ask you, Manu, between these two, because King was portrayed as an integrationist, looking at his childhood, looking at his education, looking at the influence of his family, looking at his movement activism and who surrounded him and everything else, which of these two stages was King in, the integrationist or the Black identity stage?
Well, clearly Black identity. King was somebody that was born and raised and nurtured in the Auburn Avenue area of Atlanta. This is historically Black, kind of a middle class neighborhood. And so King had always identified as Black on a regular and consistent basis. And in fact, when people are dealing with integration, particularly during that time, there were some people in the integrationist camp. They were actually amalgamationists. They wanted to make sure that they can lighten up the race, lighten up the color and literally go beyond racial boundaries and start to engage in interracial marriages. And so I remember hearing Chancellor Williams in a speech go into that. The people that hated themselves, they said, I don't want, he was talking about one of the guys in the NAACP said, in 2 generations, there'll be nobody as dark as I am. And that became a goal for some people. But for Dr.
And some of them were so no good that it'd probably be good for them. Disappear, but as an objective for the race, forget it.
And so Dr. King, and you made an interesting point a minute ago, he chose terms that were common and popular that did not always describe his position. Even though he was an independent thinker and a tremendous analyst, but he used a couple of terms. One was he did use the term integration early on because that's what was described when Black people were fighting to destroy and tear down the Jim Crow laws. Strict racial segregation laws, then it was just called integration, meaning that to get the laws changed, so Black people can be legitimate citizens and not only be in theory only. But in reality, King was not an integrationist. He was focused on Black identity on a regular basis. So we look at King, the main areas of his life, his family was all Black. And we know that if somebody really wanted to integrate, then that's one of the things you can do. Even during that time, there's some people, even though they can be beaten and physically whooped by the white racists and bigots to try to integrate or sleep with white women or marry them, whatever it is, King had no such interest. He married Coretta Scott King. They had 4 children, and he did not deal with folks outside of the race. He could have broke up his marriage or not even went in that direction and simply married someone white if he really wanted to integrate as others did. So his family was all Black. His neighborhood, the Auburn Avenue area was all Black. And we know that if somebody really wants to integrate or move outside of Blackness, then you try to move in these other areas. King had no such interest. King's only position was that Black folks should have freedom of movement, whether it's catching and riding a Greyhound bus from one state to another, which was against the law. And we know that C.O.R.E was instrumental with the Freedom Rise in 1961. This was to break down the Jim Crow system as opposed to simply going to live next to white folks. It was much bigger than that. It was about freedom and independence and being able to make choices. And so for King, his neighborhood, he never moved outside of the Auburn Avenue area. He certainly could have tried to do that. No such interest at all. So his family was all Black. His neighborhood was all Black. And his church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, was all Black. And we know that the most segregated hour in America every week is Sunday at 11 a.m. And King did nothing to change that. He was a part of the black church community, which was focused on black identity. We had the same origin, the same history, the same suffering, the same enemy, and certainly the same destiny. And King understood that. That's why he was steeped. He was steeped in the black movement for freedom. And so the church is all black, and of course his organization, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, all black. These were black ministers that organized SCLC back in 1957, and he had Stanley Livingston as a white lawyer. King was wise. He was not limited to any particular race of people he would work with. He was willing to work with anybody who was concerned about the least of these. But Stanley Livingston was one of many advisors. He had multiple advisors, multiple lawyers, but only when there was criticism that here's this man talking about integration, but look, his organization was all black. He was publicly criticized for that. That's when they tried to highlight the role of Stanley Livingston and other folks who were not of African descent. But every aspect of Dr. King's life, from his family, his neighborhood, his church, his organization, this is the totality of his life's work, and how he moved about as a great activist, and everything was focused on black people and blackness. And even when he had opportunities for integration, he didn't move in that direction. So even when he mentions it, he's talking about not moving outside of black identity. He's simply talking about integration in the sense that black folks should be integrated into the rights that any citizen should enjoy in the country. But to put it in the way that other people have presented it, like amalgamation, to really bleach out the races, some were calling it. King had no such interest whatsoever, and he certainly had all kind of offers to move and live elsewhere. But no, Auburn Avenue was his roots, and he stayed in that area until he was assassinated, at the age of 39.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the intellectual influences, Stanley Levinson was one of the few white intellectuals that influenced him, or advisors, but almost all his advisors were black,
Right.
And
Absolutely.
in the case of Morehouse College, Benjamin Mays was a major influence on him, was a supporter of the Black Freedom Movement, was one of the real strong educators, black educators that blacks produced and helped really shape King. And his father had gone to Morehouse as well. And the black church experience, for a lot of our viewers who would say, oh yeah, but that's the white Jesus and everything else, we miss the fact that the black church houses the strongest elements outside of the black family of African American culture. And blacks did not embrace Christianity through slavery, except for a small number. And there were free men and women of color that formed the AME Church and others. But the main mass black churches, Baptist, Methodist, and then Pentecostal later, and this is a specialty of mine, by the way, can't be a good organizer if you don't organize in the church. And even though the church doesn't have the influence it used to have, it's still the only institution you control top to bottom financially. Mm-hmm. And so that church has a cultural foundation. As Ella Baker pointed out, it's a black church that manifests the aesthetics of the black community. That's where the greatest beauty is. And Aretha Franklin, you know what I mean? What'd she come out of? And it was the preaching style of her father that influenced her singing style. One of the greatest singers on the planet Earth, period. Not just black folks. You know what I mean? Beauty, you want to talk about beauty? If you're a singer and you don't have a church connection, you got a problem. You got a problem. Because there's an African thing there. You know what I mean? And then the speech pattern. King's speech pattern is a hieroglyphic musical speech pattern. It's the second strongest in the black church. The swoop is the strongest. And King's sing-song style is a direct translation of African speech patterns, so-called Ebonics, Niger-Congo Bantu speech patterns in the church. And it is musical and poetic. And King, I think most people would agree, had a beautiful speaking style. It definitely wasn't white. He didn't learn it from white folks. And by the way, there's a brother who equals him, maybe even excels him in this style. Some people will be surprised. Brother Malefi Osante, who used to be a Baptist preacher. And he can actually, I think his sing-song style is even prettier than King's. That's hard. You know what I mean? But Malefi, I hear him when he's not pontificating in the English, standard English, he soars with his poetry and stuff. So he's coming out of a hieroglyphic mentality that is fostered in the Black church. And his metaphors, similes, patterns of analysis had a lot to do with that. That's very African, by the way.
Yeah,
So,
and that's a good point. And with King, in the Black tradition, he doesn't separate his sermon, his message from the reality that Black people faced. That's why he had a political gospel, a social gospel, and an economic gospel. Anybody listening to Dr. King's sermons will recognize that these were practical sermons, that he's dealing with the reality of what Black folks were dealing with. So like his last, sermon, he's talking about unfulfilled dreams, but it was always something very practical. And you learn quite a lot in Dr. King's sermons because they're not abstract at all. They're very practical, and it related to Black people in such a way that he's able to really garner the support and have people, a man with, a very erudite man, a scholar, he's an activist, but he's taking terms. And the way Dr. King used terms and articulated what it was is that even if someone had not heard the term, they understood it because of the context in which he's presenting it. So he's able to communicate in a way that others were not able to get to, because Dr. King had that, as you say, that cadence, that rhythm to be able to give insight and inspire people and to challenge them to understand the reality. But his sermons are integrated with a comprehensive gospel, not simply a pie in the sky Sunday only message. You won't hear that from Dr. King.
yeah, and that is tied to a very foundational link for African American culture, manifested in the Black church, but manifested throughout the culture. And that is, while European culture is either or, and generally tends to be despiritualized, tends to deal with the material reality and box the other one in on Sunday. The African philosophical basis, the African American cultural basis, is the union of sacred and secular, spiritual and political. And that is as basic to Black folks as breathing. And so that is a part of what was key also to that practical message that King brought down. He tied within it a spirit foundation, tied to it a political foundation. And these two were not separate because that's how the African thing works. Now, what were some of the central principles of Black culture that influenced Dr. King's values and his overall orientation? This is important because it's good for us to point out that your family's Black and your neighborhood's Black and your schooling. And by the way, as Manu points out in his manuscript, King was out of high school at 15 years of age. The boy was smart, and got a PhD real young. The boy was smart. But the key point is there were other things undergirding him that undergird Black folks. Central principles that come out of our culture. So what were some of those that influenced King?
Yeah, that's really important because, King was he was steeped in the Black tradition. He's in the Black community, the Black neighborhood, but he had a sense of justice and a sense of a calling. And you pointed out that he went to a historically Black college. He's a Morehouse man. That had tremendous influence on Dr. King and his identity. He's a Morehouse man. He comes from that tradition. But what was the overriding issue that King was responding to was the Jim Crow era of strict racial segregation and violence against Black people. So for him, he never segregated his moral concerns from just what's happening in church or in the U.S., but he's looking internationally as well. But it took him a while to get to that point of really beginning to look internationally, internationalize the struggle. But he's in a environment where black folks had no real legal rights under the Jim Crow system. Couldn't go into hotels, motels, restaurants. Couldn't ride a Greyhound bus from one state to another. Couldn't sit down at diners. And Dr. King understood that he had to address this issue, and that was not his first. I mean, he had the foundation with his father and his father's father, and being in that black community. But when Dr. King got his PhD and his theological degree, he really did not have any interest at that time in the 50s to become an activist. He had a new wife, they had children, but for Dr. King, he did not have an objective at the time of finishing his formal schooling, of going to Montgomery to be an activist. He was just looking to be a pastor in a black community, in a black church, but he was swooped up in the movement. And Dr. King understood that what was happening after World War II, that this movement for freedom, he used a German term called the Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times, and he translated it as a revolutionary spirit. And he saw himself eventually, not at first, but he eventually saw himself as a world historical figure, and he had to play a particular role to help address these issues that were confronting the black community. And it was very clear that, as you mentioned earlier, this is dangerous work, that your life would be on the line. But like Dr. King said, I would like to live a long life, but longevity has its place. And one of the things that he would always say to inform people, that he had to respond to the reality of the time. So Dr. King would say, for example, and this is one of the great quotes that really put his bravery in context, he would say, on some questions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when we must take a stand that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but we must take the stand because it is right. And that's the position that King took. He understood that he had to be the change agent, and that he had a particular role, even though initially this is not was it was not in his radar. He even wrote about the fact that it took him time. It took him years to get comfortable in his role as a world historical figure, because it was the times that produced Dr. King. People think about, the King and others creating the movement. No, the movement produced Dr. King, and he responded as any revolutionary would do. And so he was produced by the movement. Dr. King said, and he made it very clear, that he did not choose the mission, but the mission chose him. And the mission, as Francis Fanon would say, it was defined by what was happening as black folks were struggling for freedom and independence in America. And so this was the overall context in which King was influenced, but he took it to a level that other cowards would not take it, because they understood that these white folks are violent and they will shoot and kill anybody. But Dr. King said, he said repeatedly that he didn't think he would live to be 40. And he was right. He was assassinated at the age of 39. But for him, that's just what it takes when you embrace your mission. And that's why this man has to be respected. He's one of the most courageous men. And the FBI was frustrated because they couldn't intimidate him. They couldn't knock him out of his lobby. They couldn't buy him off, couldn't get him to start lecturing about rights rather than demonstrating for them. And Dr. King was not going to compromise, because he had no choice but to embrace the mission that had been given to him because of the times that black people are in. But it's the overall vicious Jim Crow era of racial segregation that forced Dr. King to eventually embrace his mission. And it took him several years, as he wrote about, to really feel comfortable embracing this tough mission with a heavy burden on his shoulders. But that's what world figures do, is step up. But again, he didn't create the movement. The movement produced Dr. King and forced him to fulfill his role.
Yeah, some other things, though, those are good insights. Some other things I'd add, because we got to be real clear. Liberation movements are generally an expression of culture, whether the people in it are fully aware of it or not. This is Cabral's observation. Most of the time, most of the cultural inspiration, people aren't even conscious of it. And some of it, they are. And so in King's case, as you locate him within the historical time, This is the post-World War II period. This is the period where Africa and Asia is rising. And not long after that, Cuba in the Caribbean. And so this is a period where the West is in decline. America is emerging as the global power, but will soon be in decline itself. So those times make it possible for a king to operate. Our movements in the North, all the movements that we can talk about, had they occurred in the 20s, a different reality, you know? So the times, your point about justice, that's real key because that's at the core of African culture. We call it Ma'at, at the core of African American culture. King was a race man. He was race conscious, as his father was, and he despised racism and despised segregation and despised the denial of freedom of Black folks. But he was race conscious. So if you look at his analysis, if he's talking about imperialism, whereas the left, I'm talking about Marxists and stuff, and again, I don't put down the left. Even though I'm doing a criticism, I don't put down anybody that wants to carry out a revolution. Go right ahead. I'm not going to stand in your way. But generally, they'll give you the class thing, the economic thing. King would bring in both, but especially the racial thing. And this idea of racial superiority, driving the white man, which drove him into the ditch in Vietnam, got his butt kicked, drove him in the ditch in North Korea, got him run out, drove him in the ditch in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places of the world, put him in decline. So King was race conscious. And that's a key principle of our culture. We see racism even where it don't exist. But most of the time we see it when it's invisible to others, but it does exist. You know what I mean? And King didn't have to worry about it not existing. King was a spirit man. As you recall, in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, there's a point where he's doubting whether he's going to continue on. And he sits at his kitchen table and the spirit visited him. And the spirit told him to stand up for freedom. And King said after that, he was able to overcome fear. You understand? Fear was not the thing that drove him. And he would tell people in SCLC, every demonstration, this may be the last time I see you, but he wasn't out for sacrifice. He just knew the savage, brutal nature of this. So that spirit, which is the guiding principle of African culture that most African historians ignore because they say it's a common feature of all cultures. It's not a common central feature of all cultures. And it's regarded as spookism in Western culture. You know what I mean? Spirit, what you talking about? You know what I mean? Don't go to a psychiatrist and say that, you know, you had an out-of-body experience. You just might get your butt committed if you're in a state where you can be committed. That's called astral projection. You know what I mean? It's real, but it ain't in the Freudian world of despiritualization. Freedom, a key principle in the culture that drove King. And then the word. The word is fundamental to African culture and African American culture. What's hip hop? Word up. Every generation is going to take this word and take it somewhere where it's hip, soulful, cool. You know what I mean? Beautiful. So again, that's an expression of culture. Humanism. That's at the core of being a human being, but it's the core of African culture and of African American culture. African Caribbean culture, Africans in South America, Africans, I don't care where you are, in Europe. You know what I mean? So King was a manifestation of that stuff. It was in him, and he's coming out of a culture that lived it, not just intellectualized it. So he learned things in graduate school. He learned things in religious seminary. So he got a lot of theories coming from white people and some from India, which came from white people, the root. But the fact is, he was grounded in a lived experience of these things, as well as an intellectual one. And those things, and I would say this about King, it was true of Malcolm, it was true of our committed people, period. He placed principles, which was the truth, above everything. And that's true of our people in general when they're committed to something. the truth mattered most. And I think I was listening to an interview with Dick Gregory, who was a supporter of our movement. He went to jail with us, and I was quite familiar with that movement in detail. But he went to jail all over the country and gave up millions of dollars. He was being interviewed on the Rock Newman show that comes out of Howard University. And Rock Newman had a lot of respect for him and a lot of other activists. And so he said, well, what do you say about King most? He said, King learned. He learned, you know what I mean? And that was the big thing. So this is just the surface. But if you're talking about kings and integrationists, I think you're going to have a hard stone wall to go up against with reality. You know what I mean? Because if he was, he wouldn't have had much to offer us as a people or the world.
Yeah, and on that point, I always say, well, documentation beats conversation every day of the week. People can say that, but where's the documentation? And, all of the places that Dr. King and SCLC could have had their annual conventions, what did they do? They chose Frogmore, South Carolina every year. So we're talking about the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia, South Carolina. That's where the Gullah and Geechee are located. This was special to have an annual reflection, annual retreat, to set the annual agenda at that area where Black culture is among the strongest and the most directly connected in terms of basket weaving and language. And this is absolutely significant. And so even though when I was in grad school, I knew that they had their retreats every year in Frogmore, South Carolina, I had no idea that these are actually the Sea Islands, which puts another twist on it because they consciously chose a specific area that Black folks were quite prominent as an expression of his embracing of the Black tradition and Black culture. So there's so many little big things that clearly indicate that King was truly a race man, a Morehouse man, a brother who was still connected at every level to the Black community. But he never lost those roots. He never severed those roots, even as he began to deal with the larger labor movement. He said there can be unity without uniformity, and then we can work with other groups. You can have a coalition without becoming like the other groups, but there's points of convergence, and this is what Dr. King taught his followers and supporters and his fellow organizers, as he stayed connected to their missions, connected to their roots, but did not lose track of the mission, even in coalitions.
Yeah, you mentioned Frogmore. I attended a number of meetings, both in the Black Freedom Movement, Black Power, and Pan-Africanist movement at Frogmore, where we did a lot of planning and stuff like that. And you're really pointing out the importance of South Carolina with its strong African roots. I'm polishing this book on Seba on pedagogy, and just finished polishing an introductory chapter on Black identity on Denmark Vesey. And that's the baddest of all the slave rebellions Blacks organized, and the best organized, with huge support. And it had a strong African and what I call New African or African American cultural foundation, with which Vesey symbolized, Denmark Vesey. So that was a whole interesting thing. There's another area in which King's legacy is distorted, and that's in the area of nonviolence. You have a nuanced view of King's stance on nonviolence. Explain that. And I think that was one of the interesting things when we talked the last time, is you brought out some stuff that a lot of people don't know. But within the context of nonviolence, what's your view of that? That King was just a strict advocate of nonviolence, period, as a way of life, period.
Yeah, back in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, when it started in December of '55, or right after it started, Bayard Rustin came from New York, and he was promoting the Gandhian philosophy and pacifism. And King had read about it, but King had not tried to apply these philosophies in any kind of movement. He's young at the time. He's listening to Bayard Rustin. So they applied a strategy of nonviolence and just to boycott the buses and make Montgomery, the city of Montgomery, pay a financial price for the disrespect of Black people having to go on the bus, pay their dime, and literally get off the bus and enter through the back door. So they figured they would cripple the city and force them to show respect. But during all of this effort, Rustin and then others began to push the philosophy of pacifism, and King began to embrace that terminology. But as time went on, you look at the sermons, the writings, the activism of King. He's actually not a pacifist, nor was Gandhi. Gandhi participated in 3 armed conflicts and wrote about it in his autobiography. In fact, Gandhi said that if it was a choice between nonviolence and cowardice, then you know, or for him, you cannot be a violence and picking up a weapon in cowardice. So you got to pick a weapon up. Gandhi did not respect cowardice. He even said that when he was attacked once, his son, if his son had been there, it would have been his son's duty to protect him. Gandhi participated on his own in World War One. Gandhi participated on his own in the Zulu Rebellion that the British were trying to put down, because Gandhi wanted to be a loyal British subject and show that he should not be put in the same category as what he called Kafirs, or so-called, it's equivalent to the N-word. Gandhi had no respect for Black people, was a vicious caste system racist that disrespected Black people. If anybody doubted, read his autobiography. If anybody doubts it, read his weekly column.
India, disrespected Black people in India.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Absolutely. And his column called My Opinion, he's clear. Gandhi wanted no part of being associated with Black folks at the low caste level, whether it was in India or South Africa. So this is the racist that King was introduced to. And King had many things coming at him. This is how he had all of these advisors, most, as you point out, Black, but then there's Stanley Livingston and others. But King understood as the movement went forward that there were practical issues. So abroad, King embraced armed revolutionary movements on the African continent, no hesitation or reservation. He called it the birth of a new age. Anybody reads his articles back in beginning in 56 and 57, he's embracing the revolutionary movements where people were picking up arms to defend themselves, protect themselves, and push out and kick out the enemy. King said these are winnable struggles. He was clear about that. He never condemns them. He never says we should support them if they'll put their weapons down. He says we rejoice with these countries that have joined the community of free nations. And in fact, the largest file that Dr. King kept in his archive was the file on Africa and the revolutionary movements. He had direct relationships with revolutionaries in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and the Mau Mau revolution in Kenya, like Tom Mboya and many other people. And never once does he say, hey, look, I think we might want to adjust the philosophy and be nonviolent. Not at all. These are winnable struggles to kick out the enemy. But for King, and he says that we should support the revolutions, meaning in Vietnam, Africa, Latin America. And he's clear about it consistently in his writings, in his interviews, in the papers. He pulled back, however, when the conservative civil rights leadership began to condemn Dr. King in 1965 and said that he is, quote, they were using the white liberal media's propaganda that he's taken away from the Black struggle in the U.S. by focusing on international issues. No, King, he did pull back. He didn't like it. The advisors say that, look, we don't want to divide the movement at this point. We don't want to take away resources and support. But in 67, King said to hell with that. And he then, without hesitation, began to, in an uncompromised fashion, criticize U.S. Involvement in Vietnam, the U.S. war in Vietnam. He says the war in Vietnam and not even a good skirmish in the U.S. He said the bombs you dropped in Vietnam exploded home with the urban rebellion. So King called for the reparations for the Vietnamese. He said the U.S. has destroyed the 2 most cherished institutions, the family and the village, and we need to pay reparations. And he said we in the West must support these people. He's not hesitant in the support for African revolutionary movements in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, not at all. But in the U.S., he said that, look, we have to be practical. And he said in the U.S., we got to face the fact that you have, he says the Army, the National Guard, the police, and an extreme right wing that would not, use his term, would not hesitate to exterminate Black people. People have to be realistic if you're talking about an armed struggle in the U.S. But for him, it was more of a practical issue. So he never believed that Black people should just be beaten and brutalized in a personal situation. He said that this is from the beginning of organized society, that people have always protected themselves. He said that's not the issue. The issue is, and he said, whether or not it is tactically wise to carry a gun or knife in a demonstration for rights. And this is what his thing. When he said the question is not about the weapon. I'm sorry. He said the question is not about self-defense in a demonstration. It's all about strategy. So for King, he believed as a minister that if everything was a perfect environment, yes, be nonviolent, but he did not commit to that position in every situation. He was simply talking about in a particular demonstration, but never did he relent on self-defense. This is why in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, there was armed men around his house to protect against the white supremacist bombers. And when Bayard Rustin, who I mentioned a minute ago, came to visit King and offer his ideas about about Gandhian nonviolent philosophy, Rustin was warned, "Hey, look out! There's a gun under that sofa," because King had a gun there. King also did not go into the Mississippi Delta to preach a funeral, a eulogy at a funeral, unless he was protected by the Deacons for Defense, armed military, paramilitary black men. King was practical. He understood that movement folks needed to be practical. He said it's not about if you should defend yourself. That is not an issue. The issue is what is our strategy. He said if anybody's carrying a knife or gun in a demonstration, he's not going to participate because it's going to then allow the media to focus on the skirmish with the police and not the issue that black people were being denied rights. So it was a practical issue for him. And this is why he says that we need to support revolutions. And he also, and that's why people should really read his works. He actually says that he would have fought in World War II against the Nazi menace and Hitler. That is not the statement of a pacifist who supposedly is unalterably committed to nonviolence. This is a man who understands there's a time and a place for everything, including self-defense and picking up a weapon. That's the same position that Gandhi always held. So the whole tradition of nonviolence as it's presented is bogus. And so that's what people have to do is read what King said, what he wrote, and what his position was. Because to think that he's someone who's committed to nonviolence as a way of life, this is not consistent with the record. As a matter of fact, his last campaign was the Poor People's Campaign, set for late April 1968. And Dr. King consistently called this the last desperate attempt for nonviolence. In other words, he was having secret meetings with the Black revolutionaries in D.C., told Stokely and a lot of other, Carmichael and others, that look, give us a few months. And if our strategy doesn't work to take over D.C. and shut down vehicular traffic, shut down pedestrian traffic, jam up the phone lines until there's a Bill of Rights in the billions, a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, give us a few months. And if that doesn't work, then you brothers can take over whatever strategy that you think would work. And this is what Dr. King was preparing his colleagues in SCLC to understand. That look, I just engaged in the truth-seeking process. I don't know. I don't have an omniscient understanding. This is just what I thought would be the best approach. And so, but we don't have all the answers. So nonviolence may or may not work. But right now, we're at a crossroads. We haven't had a victory in years since the voting rights bill. And this is what King was telling folks. I don't have any victories. In other words, how can I maintain credibility with the community when we cannot show any gains, not only in their practical way of life and their material way of life, but even in terms of laws being passed? So if a person doesn't look at the details of what King said and wrote, they will think he's just focused on nonviolence, period. He's not. He's embracing revolutionary movements without hesitation or reservation, and he becomes uncompromising and not caring what anybody said about it in 1967. And so that's when you can tell in his speeches and his press conferences, he's more angry now, and he can care less if he is in a position where he is severed relationships with the old guard civil rights folks, the big seven as they were called, because he did not agree with them. He did not agree with them. He took out a full-page ad to make it clear that he did not disagree with the direction of the Black Power movement, and he was not going to side with these people who were criticizing young activists at all. And this is when you can see in the second period that Dr. King is now more blunt to the public of his embracing of Black power that emerged in 1966, but really the use of self-defense. He had that position before, but he's not focused on it until he began to say, you know what, this is another phase in the struggle. And he began to speak in an uncompromising fashion, regardless who liked it and who didn't. And he weighed this very carefully, is whether or not he should go in that direction, because he knew he would alienate people who wanted a more softer message. But so that's what I would say about King and nonviolence. But people should read what he said, and then it becomes no debate.
Yeah, very good points. Um, Brother Manu is making the point that King distinguished between what was winnable and what wasn't. He was practical. And so he had no problem endorsing armed struggles in Africa, in Asia, and other parts of the world because they were just and they were winnable. And he was very focused on both. And his concern about having victories. And this is real key in any movement. You have to have victories. I mean, that's the point of engaging in a struggle, to produce change for your people. So that was key. And your point about he used the deacons. Well, one thing, note, King was basically an Alabama man. You know, I mean, most of his campaigns were in Alabama, you know, Montgomery, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, Selma, Alabama, you know. But S.C.C. avoided Mississippi. C.O.R.E and S.N.C.C, we were in Mississippi. That's a good reason. Your butt's going to get killed. And King especially. I mean, if there is a target that they're going to shoot, King's going to be the first one. I mean, the Klan is going to be running. It's going to be a question of who's going to get the first shot. So, of course, you're going to have the deacons in there. Of course, you know what I mean? Because you want to come out alive. You're just giving a speech. You know what I mean? So, yeah, and the deacons, I want to point this out. I was talking to Akinyele Omoja, who wrote the book on self-defense for his PhD dissertation. And I spent time in Mississippi with the deacons. And the deacons was an armed self-defense group linked to C.O.R.E. And I know the history of the deacons, but he was telling me something I didn't know. And it was that when you look at the FBI documents on the deacons, there's hardly anything. Because the deacons were not out here running their mouth. You know, the deacons were Southern blacks. Southern blacks got contradictions. I'm not going to just put them on a pedestal. There's a slavery remnant, there's a lot of stuff there. But there's a love thing going on there. And there's a communal thing going on there. And so they were tight-lipped. And so they couldn't get anything on the deacons. And I pointed this out in a previous show, and no one knows this. This is knowledge I got laying on in a freedom house outside of Bogalusa, Louisiana, in 1965. When my girlfriend, Virginia Burton, had just brought me a nickel-plated .38 Smith & Wesson Bank of America special. I had just whipped the Bank of America, so I thought this was prophecy. And then she told me I had to give it back to her. She was a Leo woman, you know what I mean? But she drove all the way from California to see that her man had a gun. And so we're laying in the Freedom House, and they're giving me the story on the deacon. And what's the story? The sisters told the brothers who were in the church to organize the deacons. Hello. That ain't in no history book. And the brothers did a good job. And the Klan knew that when the deacons was coming, hey, you could get shot. The Klan backed off on the deacons. You know what I mean? So the deacons were bad. There was a brother named Chilly Willie, who was a West Coast representative. Bad brother, tall, dark, and handsome. The sister would just melt in his presence. Ernest Thomas was his legal name. Chilly Willie was the name that stuck. And he was Chilly and Willie. Tall, dark, muscular, handsome, and smart, and bad. You know what I mean? Now, so clear this. And another point Manu made is very important to make is this. King, you made this point. I want to drive this one home. King made a distinction between the commitment to nonviolence as a way of life, which was a philosophy, and what he viewed as the commitment that grassroots blacks had. And so he wanted them, as you pointed out, to be engaged in a demonstration peacefully. But he understood when they went home, they had every right to defend themselves. You know what I mean? And that was key, because if you go into the South, blacks are armed. You know what I mean? They're armed. And they'll say it's to shoot some wild animal. Yeah, well, is it 2 or 4-legged?
Mm-hmm.
There's a main reason for having a gun in your house in the South or anywhere else, but especially the South.
Mm-hmm.
So King knew that and respected it. And you make a point in your master's thesis that when King was a kid, when it came to a fight, I hadn't read this before, you said King would say, let's go to the grass.
Right.
Means we're going to fight. And in my readings, King's best friend, Abernathy, him and him would wrestle. Abernathy said King was strong. And if you look at that body,
Right.
short, stocky guy. You know what I mean? Short and stocky. And by the way, self-defense is a cardinal principle of our culture. And we're good at it, contrary to the stereotypes. Grassroots blacks are better at self-defense than the intellectual revolutionary class who tends to advertise everything they're going to do. The grassroots does it, and you won't know who did it. You know what I mean? Because they're smart, smarter than a lot of us. So we need to check their stuff out. Because some of us are ideological, announcing what we're going to do to somebody. You don't do that. Do it. You know what I mean? And make sure there's no traces of you doing it. You know, that's how you do it. You don't go out advertising your stuff. You know what I mean? Huh? So very good, Manu. Now, this is a prelude to a question, and this is quoting from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King from his work, Where Do We Go From Here? And Chaos or Community. And this book is pretty much telling you that when King wrote this, he was at a crossroads. The movement was at a crossroads because a lot of people were asking, where do we go from here? And so King did an honest self-criticism of himself, of SCLC, and I think it was an honest self-criticism of the movement, and I want your comments on it. But I, first of all, want to say this, because this is a prelude to getting into looking at King's movement work, and then how it applies both South and North. So this is what King had to say. He said, we must frankly acknowledge that in past years, our creativity and imagination were not employed in learning how to develop power. I want to repeat this. We must frankly acknowledge that in past years, our creativity and imagination were not employed in learning how to develop power. We found a method in nonviolent protests that worked, and we employed it enthusiastically. We did not have the leisure to probe for a deeper understanding of its laws and its lines of development. Although our actions were bold and crowned with successes, they were substantially improvised and spontaneous. They obtained the goals set for them, but carried the blemishes of inexperience. So he's saying here it's a self-criticism, and I think it's a self-criticism that doesn't just apply to SCLC, that though engaged in successful struggles, they didn't enter it with an understanding of how to develop power. And as they were engaged in it, when you're engaged in a struggle, it's very hard to do the study, you know, because you're engaged in day-to-day action. And when your struggles are successful, you tend to want to repeat what works. You know what I mean? And to note that they were successful, especially because they were creative in improvising and using spontaneity in their improvising. So as a prelude to examining King's organizational contributions, let's talk about what King meant by this critique of the Southern movement and the Black freedom movement at large. What do you think of this critique, Manu?
Yeah, I think that King is, he's very honest. That's why looking at the meetings with his SCLC staff is fundamental to recognizing, looking at his understanding, and also what their strategies were, the reflection on what they've done in the past, what they've accomplished, and what still has to be done. Um, King is very clear that their approach was just what they used. He didn't know that it would solve all of the problems. He never really took that position. He was just engaged in the process. That's why he says that, look, I don't have some omniscience understanding. I don't have all the answers. We're just engaged in this process. But King definitely understood that there was a fundamental difference in the regions of the country. What could work in the South, for example, if you have hundreds, if not thousands of people marching in a small town, you're going to shut the town down. But he said that in Chicago, on the other hand, you can have those same number of people, but because of the size of the city, he says it's just passing fancy. People take note, but they're not really being impacted by it. So we recognize there had to be a different understanding of how to impact the North. But King understood that one of the biggest understandings that he had to develop and have his colleagues understand is how to acquire power. So King recognized regional differences, but he soon moved away from this moral idea to recognize it was really about obtaining power. And this is why he's constantly dealing with acquiring power. He talks about it in the book there, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. He has a whole section on the Black Power movement, and he constantly is referring to Black Power in his presentations. One of his greatest articles is Black Power Defined. And so, by this not being a prominent article that's promoted and understood and read by the public today, is just because people don't understand King. And so, he constantly talked about power, but this is after 65. This is once those laws were on the books. Now he understood that you can have laws on the books, and those brothers and sisters in LA and Watts made it very clear that you can sign a voting rights bill on August the 6th, 1965. That didn't mean anything. It did not change the reality in the North and in the West when people had certain rights on paper. That's why King said laws declare rights, but they don't deliver the rights. The people themselves have to go out and act. And it was very powerful that the voting rights bill was passed on August the 6th, and then 5 days later, brothers and sisters blew up. They started to burn down and blow up in the Watts area. And as to let folks know, it doesn't mean anything to us. And King understood that it was about power and the powerless. And this is so his real education. We talked about Morehouse. He went to Boston University. He goes to these places, but his real learning, his real PhD was in urban studies. That's his real PhD, when he really moved past the Southern issues to really recognize the national issues and that Black people lack power. So he starts talking about structural powers and a structural problem in acquiring power. So, for example, King mentioned this in his one of his Frogmore, South Carolina presentations to his staff. He says there's nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. Then he said that power is the ability to achieve purpose. Certainly, the Negro needs power because this is our problem. We are powerless. We have been powerless economically and politically, and the ghetto itself, in a sense, came into being because the Negro is in a powerless position. Then he goes on and to continue talking about this, but in his book, he mentions power is not the white man's birthright. It will not be legislated for us and delivered in neat government packages. It is a social force any group can utilize by accumulating its elements in a planned, deliberate campaign to organize it under its control. And this is what King understood. Even if you have laws passed in the South, it's not going to change anything by itself. People have to go out and act. And it came down to having power. And this is why he's focusing more and more on the acquisition of power. And he had to teach people that this is what was one of the fundamental things that the Black community, whether it's in the North, South, the West, or anywhere else, lack, and that is power. And this is why he begins to focus on this more and more and more. And so for him, Black Power, not as a slogan, he didn't really agree with the just talking about Black Power, but Black Power as an organized program became one of the central
That's something we'll get into. We'll get into that in a minute. That one.
Mhm. Yes. So that's what I would say is that when he began to understand the the national issues beyond the South, that's when King really grows and gets his real practical PhD in urban studies. When he really takes it to Chicago and the folks in LA let him and others know that that legislation don't mean nothing. But King was conscious enough to know and honest enough to reflect and to recognize that, you know what, we have to continue to evolve and adjust our strategy. And he did not let himself be manipulated by the government and by different city officials who wanted King to go to L.A. and other places to put down the rebellions. King said, "I'm not a fireman. Yes, sure, it's unfortunate that their properties being torn up in their own neighborhood, but these are real legitimate." Um, cries of pain because they've not their humanity and their needs have not been addressed. But I ain't no fireman. I'm not going in to put down any issue. What you need to do is address the fundamental issues that cause the people to rise up. And so King was constantly learning and reassessing. That's why to know King really requires that people look at the fact that his real higher level education took place after 1965. So that is the most critical period in his development because it's the king that is least understood, least known, and the most dangerous to the government and white supremacists who wanted to run their same agenda, but not with a conscious group of black folks who now zeroing in on power and not simply have laws changed here and there. Because King said they didn't have to give up anything. Laws were changed and so white folks got some improvement with bargain rates. In fact, it assuaged their guilt of being, as he called the folks in South Africa, but he applied it to the U.S. too. These were spectacular savages that engaged in this kind of brutality against citizens, and so that's what he called them, spectacular savages. And so King was looking at the core of this vicious system. That's why he always talked. And one of the great things about King, he's an ever present historian. He never gives a sermon or a major speech without the history lesson, and he's always informing people that America. He calls it white supremacy. He calls it racism as well. But it depends on what speech he's saying. He always talks about that racism is as native as the pine trees, the sagebrush, and the buffalo grass. That's how native it is. He said it's so ingrained in the U.S. system that it lightly burdens the conscience. And this is what he always wanted people to know is that that's what we're dealing with. He said that's the monster, as he called the monster of racism that we're addressing, and not simply getting a few laws changed or a few attitudes changed. Is deeply rooted into the American system. And he understood that as he began to move out of the South to look at, the more broader issues that affect black folks all over the country and beyond.
Brother Lao Tzu has a question here that's appropriate for this. Talking about he loves the revelation about King and his emphasis on power not being the sole right of white people. He said, where would I find this in his writings, references to power?
You can get the book that Brother T'Shaka just showed. That's the last of the 5 books that King wrote. Where do we go from here? And go to page 157, and you'll see King addressing this issue of power. Also in the book, look at the section on Black Power, where King gives his perspective on how the Black Power movement developed in 1966 and his position on it. So you can get the section in the book. Also, you should be able to find the essay that Dr. King wrote called Black Power Defined, where he's talking about organizing Black power as we approach the labor movement, the political arena, the economic arena. And when he's talking about Black power defined, he's talking about he's criticizing young folks in SNCC. Y'all just talking about a slogan. He said what's needed is a practical program that we can implement to acquire power, and he addresses that in Black Power Defined. So those are a couple specific sources that you could consult, and you'll see him in his detailed assessment of how do we move forward with the perspective that we need power and not just some sentimental idea about anything else. So that's what I would share.
Yeah, now to add some stuff to that, then those are good points that you're making. I would say that overall, when King says we weren't trained for building power, that is correct. And in the case of the San Francisco freedom movement, I'll speak from personal and organizational experience. Um, my awakening comes in 1963, and it comes around me understanding that I don't understand how the country's run. And I've been miseducated on it. I'm a government major. I mean, and I don't understand who runs the government. And that was a big fat awakening. Corporations run it. You understand? But then that meant I didn't know myself. Because if you don't know your enemy, you don't know yourself. And those are the two rules in war. So our miseducation made us ill prepared for this, because the miseducation that we got, whether in white colleges, in my case, or black universities, or wherever, didn't prepare you for this. And so the battlefield became the classroom along with hitting the books. This is key. And it's hard to battle and hit the books at the same time. But if you don't hit the books, you're not going to know the enemy. You're going to have to know which books to hit. So that was lesson number one. King's comment is not just good for the Southern movement. It was true for all of us. You know what I mean? One of the things that I would say about that is that in studying the thinkers that are coming out of the West, King makes a comment alongside this statement that he didn't think we had that many deep thinkers. And he thought that while the West had produced some, we hadn't produced enough. Well, actually, we had quite a few. And the question is, which ones was King looking at? You know what I mean? Because in terms of the U.S., a number of thinkers that were really relevant for King, Lerone Bennett. Now, Lerone Bennett's book, Negro Mood, is written in the midst of the Birmingham campaign, best analysis of the Black establishment. So that would be in 63, 64. This is before 65. That is the best analysis of the Black power system that has been set up to control Blacks. And Atlanta is one of the control centers. The Black colleges are viewed as a control center. Chicago is another, so that was something being developed by a Black thinker who was coming out of inspiration from King's best campaign, which was Birmingham. Operation Confrontation inspired him. But because Lerone Bennett was a part of the Black establishment, he could see and was a historian. He could give the pictures. I've told people before, read Negro Mood, read the chapter Voices from the Cave, read the chapter Black Establishment. Best analysis. It'll beat the Boule and all the rest of this stuff that you get. I mean, if you think fraternities are running things, or if you think that white secret societies are running things, you don't know how America's run. And so the classroom was the battlefield, and realizing, in my case, we didn't know the enemy, it forced us to learn. And again, fighting the corporations was the best teacher, because it taught you their strengths and weaknesses and how to defeat them. So that was key, the awakening. When King makes this comment about we didn't have enough strong thinkers, I think the question is, which ones was he drawing from? Because Martin R. Delaney was a strong thinker. Blyden, who came from the Caribbean and affected African American and African thought, Edward Wilmot Blyden, a strong thinker. Chancellor Williams, a strong thinker. Garvey, he put a movement forward that had some power. So if you want to examine power, especially globally, the Garvey movement is really key to understanding Black global power, both strengths and weaknesses, because Garvey made mistakes, but he mobilized the most far-flung movement and organized the most far-flung movement of Africans in the Western Hemisphere. You know what I mean? And it came out of African American culture, Ethiopianism. He never used the word Pan-Africanism, but Ethiopianism. Princes shall come forth out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall stretch forth his hand unto God soon. That was Garvey. That's Rastafarianism. You know what I mean? And that's what inspired a lot of slave revolts that had a Christian component to it. because most blacks weren't Christian. So, um, we have thinkers, and some were evolving alongside of him. Malcolm, were evolving alongside of him. People coming out of the Black Freedom Movement were evolving, and he was evolving. King himself, you know what I mean? So we need to look at our own sources, but also look at the sources from Africa. But I think the biggest weakness that we've had when it comes to understanding power during King's time, because it's especially important to assess it then, not to be unfair and do what we know now and say they should have known it then, but also what we need to know now. We know the white thinkers on racism. We don't know the white thinkers on power. And guess what? That's the one that you should really know. And it's when they link the power to racism that becomes genocidal. And that's basically what Western imperialism has been. It's been a genocidal project. It just hasn't been colonialism, imperialism. They were about killing off people of color as they did among Native Americans. So the key thing to understand about white power is this: it's arbitrary. Whoever has it does whatever they want. And so when you're coming from a moral standpoint, you're going to have trouble understanding this. Because, even though King had began to move away from this idea of moral persuasion, he still had an ethical core. There's no ethics in the Western worldview. And as I pointed out before, Western philosophy is teleological. That means amoral. That means it's only concerned about what works. And that's the good part of it too, because you better be concerned about what works. But you better have some morals behind your stuff. It doesn't mean you have to be moral in how you win, as long as your objectives are moral. I don't know if you get that point. I'm not giving the examples. You know what I mean? So we need to be studying their thinkers who aren't just dealing with racism, because they are, but are dealing with their view of power over nature, over the cosmos, and over Earth. And we haven't studied those. And that is the real weakness in our arsenal. We get exposed to all the exceptional European thinkers that had something moral to say and had no influence on European policy or the European worldview. The other thing I'd say about power is this, and this was key to King's lessons, because while King said they had not, they entered the struggle not knowing how to build power, and that continued to be a problem, he also should give himself some credit, because within there he said, but we did have successes, and it came from spontaneity and improvisation. That's a quality of African American culture. That's the core quality. That's how our power is exercised: spontaneous and organized. King made a comment in the midst of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. He said it's amazing how disciplined Black people are in the pursuit of freedom. He didn't know. That's the definition for power and freedom for African people. It's creativity. And that's spontaneous. That means when you get in a situation, figure out how that situation works and then apply it. His critique was that we didn't have enough organization, but you have to understand that your organization proceeds from your culture. Theirs is arbitrary. Theirs is also set piece. So when you engage them, they have a plan, A to Z. And the way you beat that is you always come up with an angle that they don't have, that they never planned for. You never go in a predictable mode. And then it's to build power. And then the fundamental thing is power is institutional. In America, institutions rule the land. Corporations are the institutions that rule the world. And so Blacks have moved away from institutional power. Since the 80s and 90s, we ain't building institutions other than the church, We have mass demonstrations, but institutions is where it's at. And it's brick and mortar. It might be a building that houses something, but it's programmed, whether it's economic, whether it's political, whether it's educational. The final thing I'd say about power is power for Black people resides in our people. And it's a question and the masses of our people. the ones who belong to no organization, and that's the majority of our people, as well as those who do. And so it's how you aggregate those numbers into power combinations that then produces power, but it comes from the people. But I would say of all the weapons we have of power, our culture is our greatest weapon. And in the 60s, we weren't conscious of this. We were talking, some of our scholars were saying, we need to wake up. We were waking up.
Yeah.
And it was our culture that was at the source of it. And it's our culture that makes us move. So, but King's point is absolutely accurate. And that's a prelude to getting into examining some of King's major campaigns, because this show is about the real Dr. Martin Luther King. The revolutionary part is very important, but it's important to understand what is it that King did that produced some change and then moved to some other issues. So let's examine the 4 central campaigns that King engaged in: the Montgomery Bus Boycott, the Albany Movement, the Birmingham Campaign, and the Selma Campaign, which were improvised, spontaneous, and organized. And they had successes in most cases and a failure in one. So what do these campaigns tell us about the strengths and limits of King's model of organization and power in the South and for his coming movement to the North? Manu.
Yeah, I think those are, the prominent campaigns during the first period, and they all taught King. And so, most of he wrote 5 books. Most of his books comes out of these struggles. So that Stride Towards Freedom, for example, comes out of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And, and then in Birmingham, it's Why We Can't Wait, because people were telling Dr. King that, look, you're nothing but a troublemaker. You come into our city and you disturb race relations. You cause problems when all of the so-called Negroes are satisfied. And then why don't you let time solve the problem? And King's response was, time is neutral. It can be used effectively or ineffectively. And the problem is, in America, the people of ill will, but the negative people, use time far more effectively than those of goodwill. But this is where he receives his real learning, because at that point, they had some successes. For example, in Montgomery, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, they learned largely from the example in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. That boycott in '53, they recognized that boycott had too many goals, too many objectives, too many things that they had on the agenda to achieve. So they streamlined it in Montgomery and was able to benefit from the failure of what happened in Baton Rouge. Failure in terms of meeting these stated objectives, but at least it did confront this vicious white power system. But in Montgomery, they were successful. They had national, international support, financial support, but they were organized. I think one of the things that King learned is the power of organization, because as commonly thought, people think that Montgomery just kind of sprung up. It did not. They were already organized, already ready for the right test case. They already had the carpools set up. They had the phone tree set up. They already had things set up. They had the posters already made. They were waiting on the right test case in order for another woman, sister. They had a poster already made, and it said another Negro woman arrested. And Joanne Robinson, the head of the Women's Political Council, simply made thousands of copies of that flyer that was already made. But what King understood and learned in the Montgomery movement is that it was organization. This is why, for him, he understood that Black folks organized could make a tremendous impact. And this is why he's one of the great unifiers. King is able to bridge the gap and to really get people together to have different views, different philosophies, and try to find a middle ground, even within his own ranks. You had Jesse Jackson, and you might have a Ralph Abernathy or Andrew Young, and King was always a central person to try to bring folks together. So he understood that was a model that was working in that first period, and it allowed them to meet the goals they had, which is to get legislation passed. That's what they got legislation passed in Montgomery, with the Montgomery Bus Boycott, the Civil Rights Movement, right after Civil Rights Bill, that is, right after the Birmingham campaign, where the white supremacists and racists and bigots were put on national and international display. And in '65, they got the Voting Rights Bill passed when the entire world saw Bloody Sunday. So King learned from these efforts, and this is really what shaped his understanding of how to get things done. But that was in the Southern environment. The next set of campaigns were very important. The Chicago, but and of course Albany is not talked about as much because Chief Pritchard read Dr. King's book and what their strategy was. So he didn't let King just stay in jail and draw media attention, public attention. So they Pritchard had put up the money to get King bailed out of jail. King thought it was the movement folks that bailed him out. No, it was the racist sheriff who bailed King out. So he could not build a movement there. That was in '61. So what Pritchard read about the Montgomery bus boycott, he was able to undermine some of their effectiveness there and really stops. But King learned, he learned along the way. And I say that was the first period. But that second period, those campaigns are very important, whether we look at Chicago or Memphis or the Poor People's Campaign. Those are not, to me, they're not looked at as prominently as they should be, because that's where we really get King engaged in campaigns when he's also engaged in his advanced degree in urban studies, because just about every example is always usually from that first period. The first period is important, but it's not the only period. It's those campaigns during the latter period when King has a better understanding. It's about power. It's about organizing in a large urban environment. And he's not always successful, but he does challenge and question the inner core of this vicious system. And as he called it, he said it was the handiwork of white supremacy. That's what he called this whole system. And so he was somebody that learned from those Southern campaigns, but actually, went beyond that to that second phase to understand the significance of what was happening in the northern environments in those major urban cities. So I would say that we look at the different periods, and we have to look at King regionally in these periods and what he was able to learn. That's why he said that the Poor People's Campaign was the last desperate attempt for nonviolence, and his book, A Testament of Hope. I'm sorry, excuse me, his book, A Trumpet of Conscience. This was a series of 4 lectures that he gave in Canada called the Massey Lecture. That's when King is organizing now. He's getting the word out to organize the campaign in August. And this is when King is outlining and clarifying what this Poor People's Campaign would look like and how they would dislocate cities and shake up urban America and make sure that Congress paid attention to the poor and to Black people that didn't have very much. But King thought this was the last desperate attempt for nonviolence. And so that Poor People's Campaign frightened the FBI, and they made sure that he never got a chance to implement the plan and program that he called a last desperate attempt for nonviolence. And King meant that. He knew that he would have no other opportunity to promote a strategy that was not working anymore, and the government made sure that they assassinated him. J. Edgar Hoover made it clear that he leaked all kind of information to make sure that King wasn't successful. One other campaign that's crucial is the one in Memphis too, because clear he's organizing and he's recognizing the significance of labor and supporting the Black labor movement in his work. So those are ones that although they didn't always meet all of the objectives, but they were important because King is drawing attention to them, and they begin to organize beyond what was happening in the South. And it made sense. If the laws are on the books, now you have to turn to other areas to address the vicious American system, because the laws are on the books. That's why he would always say that laws declare rights, but the people have to deliver the rights. In other words, they have to go out and act. So I think that the ones you mentioned are the prominent ones, they're the big ones, but they're all in the first period. They're all in the South. But those second period, when I say second period, this is what King said: first period, second period. He meant the human rights period in the urban areas is what shapes him just as much, I believe, as that first period.
Yeah, very important. I'm going to make some comments, and then there's a question up here that I think is good. It's time for your comments. Basically, these campaigns, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma, which were the successes, they revealed the methodology that King developed that worked, and it produced civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation, and the success in the Montgomery bus boycott. And they were basically boycott in the case of the Montgomery bus boycott. And this was the withdrawal of economic power from the buses. It took a year, but you had 97% support of the Black community. I mean, that is profound. This is a key thing to get straight. while you have great leaders and movements, nothing happens until the people decide to move. And even the people themselves were surprised that they would move at 97%, because our culture is spontaneous, and organization comes out of spontaneity, and it's race conscious. But to get us to unify that way is a rare thing. So 97%, 97% of white people have never done anything together in their history. I'm a historian. I study them. Never. That's a big deal. And it's out of that that a king's produced, because it's the people that produce him, you know. The boycott was a method, and a bunch of, as you pointed out, a bunch of community people played a role in that. E.D. Nixon, the Women's Political Council, and others, you know, along with the ministers, and then the grassroots and the middle class, because it was a unification of both the elite and the masses in this. In the case of Birmingham and Selma, it was the march, and it was the dramatization of the march. So it was the theater of the march. And so they had come up with a method that worked, where they could use an evil villain, in the case of Bull Connor, sicking dogs on young babies, which was the idea of King's best mobilizer, to bring out the children. And a lot of people criticized him for this, but that was Birmingham. People got killed in these movements. And in fact, they had blown up Shuttleworth's house, and Shuttleworth was the leader in Birmingham, Alabama. So it was the children who hadn't reached the point of fear that could be the battering ram. And it was James Bevel's King's best mobilizer, because that's basically what King did, was mobilize. They came up with that. And so it was the theater of sicking those dogs on people and fire hoses and everything else that put pressure on the government to enact that legislation. And it was the march that was the main tool. And that was planned. So King had moved from spontaneity to planning, which, by the way, is a part of spontaneity in African American culture. It's spontaneous organization. That's what it is. And so out of the errors of Albany, Georgia, came Birmingham, King's best organized campaign, in my opinion, called Operation Confrontation. And by the way, that campaign on a national level began to educate Black people much more on a mass level to the existence and nature of the white power structure, you know, and that was what he was trying to confront in Birmingham. So the boycott and the march, and then Selma to Montgomery, it was Bevel's wife who came up with that idea, and that produces voter rights. So those are the methods that worked, that came out of spontaneity, out of these movements. And the question is going to be, how did these work in the northern setting? Now, there's a comment up here by King Pianki. And by the way, the brother had me on one of his shows, and nice little show, brother. I enjoyed it. This is his question to you. Dr. Manu, in my studies of Dr. King, I was under the impression that King was a great mobilizer, but lacked when it came to organizing. Is there any truth to the above statement?
Well, I mean, I don't think we can get everyone to be great in every area. You know, King's role was to mobilize. You know, and King's role was to mobilize. King role was to draw attention to what was happening. S.C.C. was able to sustain some efforts on their own. SNCC was certainly more grassroots, more on the ground. They're the ones that kindled the fire and work with the local communities, but they couldn't do it alone. So that's where the S.C.C. and King came in. There was some tension between the groups, but we have to, recognize that King's greater strength was to mobilize. But I think that he's the one who was a strategist. He provided vision. He's the one that would articulate, and not just to the media, but you can see in meetings with SCOC, King is strategizing and articulating what needs to happen step by step and inspiring people. So I think that, yeah, he's better at mobilizing. And he did not spend enough time in local communities to do all of the organizing. That wasn't his role. You had local organizers that could get so far, but they also needed a king to be able to give credibility to the efforts, to the grassroots efforts. And so they all worked hand in hand, and there was, different roles. So yeah, I would say he was more effective at mobilizing, but he was not a zero in organizing. It just wasn't something that he focused on, and that wasn't his role. King traveled about 400,000 miles a year, 320 some thousand miles a year, going to different campaigns in the U.S. and around the world. So he's not going to be there on the ground doing all of the organizing, but he certainly was an accomplished mobilizer. But King was stretched to the extent that he's working 20-hour days. And you know what he did every year? How he wrote 5 books, working 20 hours a day. He tried his best to be home on Sundays whenever he could, if he could. But King spent time. He spent time in Jamaica every year at the beginning of the year around January for review and reflection and writing. That's how he wrote his books when he was in
It was a month, wasn't it?
he spent about a month in Jamaica, and he made a comment to his staff that I got to be fresh. I can't just go from campaign to campaign with the same old statements and comments. So his role was different, and I don't think that is any less important. Whether he's mobilizing or organizing on the ground. But if you're organizing and you don't have the numbers and the belief, then you're going to be limited as well. So this is why King played a role to help those who were organizing on the ground. But I'm quite aware of the tension. S.N.C.C called him the Lord. The Lord's going to come in, and yeah, but without King, matter of fact, King was actually a better strategist as far as I'm concerned. He understood more. It's a lot of young people. It's just a lot of rhetoric. Just like people will quote Malcolm, it's just rhetoric. Yeah, well, Malcolm talked about self-defense. Who did Malcolm organize with guns to go after anybody? He was just stating a principle that we should defend ourselves, and King stated the same principle. There's no statement King ever makes that black people should not defend themselves. He embraced the same principle as Malcolm. It's just that he told the young people, you got to be willing to be honest about a bloodbath and count the bodies and not just talk about picking up guns. He thought that if people weren't careful, they would give the right wing and the police and the white public the ability or the justification to just kill off a whole lot of black folks. And not everybody was looking at it from that angle. This is why King was not light. He did not take it lightly when you talked about self-defense and so forth. He's focusing on it abroad, but at home, he's more practical because he understands what could happen in the U.S. But he gets to a point where he is working with those who were on the ground, who are organizing, and he tells them that you might have a different strategy, and let us try nonviolence one last time and see if it works. But the bottom line is the Poor People's Campaign. This is something that King articulated, that he promoted, and his organization was in the forefront of organizing. King was building alliances. He's organizing with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers and other groups. So people talk all this nonsense about King's birthday, and that's nonsense. King ain't riding no freedom train and all this other nonsense. King on his birthday, after he had breakfast, he had breakfast 8 a.m. From 10 to 1, he's organizing this Poor People's Campaign. He himself is in the midst of organizing what would have been, one of his greatest campaigns, because for King, it was a showdown in D.C. And this is how he presented it. This is how he understood it. And he was not going to back down until there was a fundamental shift in resources to really help the least of these. So I think we have to look at all of these different elements and angles if we're going to really understand Dr. King's role. But the Poor People's Campaign is a fundamental campaign that he is organizing. You can read his Trumpet of Conscience to see how he's promoting it, and all of the press conferences and statements that he's making around the country as he is pushing this. This is not being pushed by, the S.N.C.C organizer, the Black Power advocates per se. It's King looking to organize this, and they did. They got thousands of people there. It's just that he was assassinated before it can be implemented. And Ralph Abernathy, who was a trusted right-hand person of King, very loyal, but he did not have the ability to articulate and inspire people as King did. So I think we want to recognize his greatest strengths and not see his mobilization ability to bring people as the only area in which he excelled, you know. But his writings also had a tremendous impact too in directing and correcting people in this ongoing debate between King and those who were still moving to the radical left as they were, you know, embracing Black Power as a program. So I think, you know, those are some of the thoughts I would have.
Yeah, I think that's a good question because basically King was a mobilizer. And uh, all of those campaigns, those were marches, those were rallies. And in the case of Montgomery, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, it was a boycott, a withdrawal of economic power. But essentially, mobilizing was the method that worked. And you can't criticize them for it. It got results. And the point you're making, SNCC was more a group of organizers, and they were around a philosophy. They organized around the philosophy. The people are the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Their process was slower, and it didn't produce as many dramatic results. But what it did do was emphasize and build organizational leadership at the local level. And that model is the model that is really suited for today, and sometimes a mixed model. Because today with Black Lives Matter, you see the march, which is the signature King thing, but then you see the group-centered leadership, which really befuddles the FBI and the power elite. They don't know who in the hell is leading this. You know what I mean? And it requires that kind of leadership at a time where family and community institutions are broken down. You know what I mean? So it's going to be a much more diverse and where problems are more complex. So that's a good point. And there's another question here um, raised by Sir. Go ahead.
Brother, if I can add this, because you mentioned a key point, which is not known too much or not emphasized at least, and that every campaign that King was involved in, every campaign had an automatic economic boycott component, every single one. And that's what the FBI used to lure King to the Lorraine Motel to assassinate him. For example, in the Memphis sanitation workers strike, when they were looking to unionize and protect the lives of Black sanitation workers, King was staying at the Holiday Inn, which is a white-owned hotel. J. Edgar Hoover used his anti-Black media sources to leak out propaganda and said that King's a hypocrite. He's telling Black people to boycott businesses that are not supporting his movement, but yet he himself is staying at the white-owned Holiday Inn. Why don't he stop being a hypocrite and go down the road to the Black motel, the Lorraine Motel, so he will stop being a hypocrite? And that's why Dr. King decided, you know what, he's not going to fight this public battle in the media about where he's staying. That's why he went to the Lorraine Motel. So he was lured there by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI based on the fact that King and his group always had an economic component to make white businesses and white business community pay a price for continuing with these Jim Crow segregation methods that dehumanize Black people. If you're going to do that, you will pay a financial price. So as well, it's very important to know that. And I saw an interview, one of the Black Lives Matter activists who are like some of these folks who don't understand. One of the commentators, one of the CNN hosts had asked, he had asked Martin Luther King III about the movement, and Dr. King's son, Martin Luther King III, said, you know what? Economic boycotts, they're effective. That's what the movement used. And the young activists said, we don't need to do all that. The police just need to stop brutalizing Black people. Really? That means you don't even understand the basics of what was used as leverage against the white establishment. That is to make them pay economically. So the Montgomery bus boycott was directly focused on that. But all of the other campaigns, so in Selma, in Birmingham, or Birmingham as they call all the places, they all had an economic boycott component that was an automatic part of their campaign. So that should be known by folks.
Yeah, and what the previous question indicated is that King, as a mobilizer, would, in his northern thing, and in his move for restructuring, have to combine that, but especially move to a more organizational model. And that would be something that he'd have to grapple with. So I think that was a key point there. Sister Ajua, she asked a question. Will the two scholars address the continuing falsity of Dr. King's alleged waywardness in his marriage? You want to?
Yeah. Okay. So this is the evidence coming from the FBI, led by the freaky J. Edgar Hoover. He was a sexual freak. J. Edgar Hoover. He's supposed to be the top law enforcement agent, head director of the FBI. And so when he was spying on Dr. King and the Kennedys, it wasn't just their political activity. This man was a sexual freak that was concerned about everything they did. So all of this. So most of the alleged stuff about King, it comes from the FBI records that are still sealed. They're still sealed until 2025. And so no one's seen them because they're locked away in the National Archives. The court ruled that they had to be sealed for 50 years. That's two generations, from 1975 to 2025. And so, Ralph Abernathy makes some reference to it, but it's important to know that when Ralph Abernathy writes his book and the walls came tumbling down, Abernathy clearly is in mental decline as an older person. Dementia was there. You can see in his interviews that this is not the same Ralph Abernathy. So what Abernathy writes about in his book, and he passes away shortly after that, you really have to verify it. I mean, not that he's making up stuff, but you know what? Over time, memory fades, and memory certainly fades even faster when the mental clarity is lost as well. But those are the two main sources for the most part about King's alleged sexual activity. But this was the FBI looking to knock King out of his lobby, to move him from his work. But everybody who's looked at it knows that J. Edgar Hoover was not only consistently breaking the law, but he was a freak. Now, the only thing that is not clear about J. Edgar Hoover is the criticisms of him being a cross dresser, dressing as a woman. That's still not clear. But his other stuff regarding sexual comments or claims, you really have to take with a grain of salt, because everybody that has studied the FBI knows that those records, first of all, these are aggressive white boys who are prone to make errors. When you go to the FBI archives, there's all kind of errors, and they have an agenda as well to demonize King. They believe that King. They were convinced that King had no legitimate cause; that he was simply a communist tool, and that when they're and that's it. It was a communist influencing King and a communist influence in everybody else in the movement. That's why, as I said earlier, the records are under communist influence in racial matters. That's the FBI file. So we can speculate and so forth, but I would say by looking at the records directly, what the FBI said, what's locked in the archive, this is simply to smear King. And even if he had some wayward ways, uh, it is still hearsay, because the original records don't exist, and the people closest to him never confirmed this until Abernathy is pretty much on his deathbed. So I would say that we really have to not allow the media to focus on that, as opposed to, because so more people are concerned about that. Not that it's not a legitimate question, but they seem to be more focused on that than the content of Dr. King's his campaign that he lays out in Where Do We Go From Here, where he lays out what are the steps and strategies to solve the problems. But there can be some some activity outside of his marriage, but at the same time, um, the specific details are in question until those records are released. And to rely on the FBI as a major source is a fundamental problem that anyone would have to address. Because I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours in that archive, and it's stunning the level of sickness of these cats, and also the how the white public would send in materials that they thought could be useful to the FBI. So it is in their interest to focus on anything about Dr. King that could be smeared because they feared him as the number one threat to U.S. security. So it's a legitimate question, but I think those records in 3 years from now will, give a lot of specific firsthand evidence and not the hearsay that we've been saddled with over the years.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm going to preface my answer with this. I think when King went to the higher realm, um, the indiscretions, and I know for a fact they did exist. I know for a fact they did exist, and I'll give you some evidence of it. I'm sure that God slapped him on the hand and put him in the highest regions of heaven, but told him, Martin, you weren't supposed to do that. So I'm going to quote Andy Young. Um, Andy Young said, King didn't just like women, he liked stallions, stacked to the max. It would really be a highly stacked, because stallion's mare, what I mean? So he liked women of a certain shape and all of this kind of stuff. And I was in the National C.O.R.E headquarters. I was elected National Treasurer of C.O.R.E in 1965. I led the real Black Power move in the Black Freedom Movement. That was not a slogan, it was a program. I carried it out the 65 C.O.R.E convention in Durham. And then I went throughout the South in Mississippi, in Bogalusa, Louisiana, in Florida, in South Carolina. And then I came back to the national office, stayed at James Farmer's house, and Farmer was director of C.O.R.E. And Farmer was on his way to J. Edgar Hoover to try and get him not to release what he had on King. So King had an active sexual life outside of marriage. It's a fact. And he said, I won't use the graphic word, but he said that relieves stress. You know what I mean? So it did happen. And King, also remember this, and I'm not justifying this behavior. I don't engage in this behavior, so I'm not justifying it. But King was in demand not only as a speaker, he was like a symbol. And so women were all around him. And I'm not saying, therefore, it's their fault. I'm simply saying they were available and King had a predisposition. And some preachers do, not all, some do. So that's a fact. King also had some other issues when it came to women, and he had issues with Ella Baker. Part of them had to do with different organizational approaches because King was a mobilizer, she was an organizer. But they both had the same background, both coming out of church politics, church culture. They were very similar. Both straight A students, both Southern. She was older. She had more experience. You know what I mean? But so he had an issue with her because she was a dominant sister. She was no joke. You know what I mean? And Andy Young explained the main reason. This is in a footnote. You should always read the footnotes in books. The main stuff's important, but the footnotes are really revealing. King's father was a strong figure in the community. He was a leader against racism. But in the house, his wife ruled, probably because of her personality and the way his and those work. That's how relationships go, partially because King's father gained access to leadership of Ebenezer Baptist Church through his wife, whose father had been head of that church. That's part of it, but I think it had to do with other things. So King also had a resentment of Black women who were too strong because it reminded him of his mother. That's Andy Young talking, and he's talking about his own interaction with King, and I think that's probably true. And it doesn't mean that he didn't have any respect for women. And remember, this is the 50s and the 60s, so there's a whole different relationship of Black men to Black women. And a lot of the women's issues that have come up later didn't come up then, and especially in the Black church. So that's another side of that. But yeah, he did have it. And in the case of what Manu's talking about, J. Edgar Hoover was gay. And what happened is organized crime had that on him. And as a result, he said there was no organized crime because they could release that. Everybody in Washington knew it, but no one was going to say it because J. Edgar Hoover had dirt on everybody. That was the nature of how he operated. So he would, during the 30s, the Depression, they were arresting bank robbers. When did they go after organized crime? Bobby Kennedy, went after labor union leaders, who had delivered, along with the mafia, had delivered the vote for Kennedy. 200,000 votes, the black vote or the stolen vote coming out of Chicago delivered the presidency. And then they get vamped on by, the Kennedy administration. So he was silenced. FBI was silenced on organized crime because they had the goods on him in the bedroom. You know what I mean? So he had his nerve, this is Manu's point, of being critical of anybody's sexuality. But so, yeah, King had a weakness in that area. But at the same time, he had the integrity in terms of his politics, but that was unfortunate. I mean, I ain't gonna clean up for that, and you weren't either. And you're right that there's probably more evidence going one way or the other. I don't know. You know what I mean? So now, in moving northward, King had an observation, particularly 65 and on, about the Black freedom movement in the North. And this is important because King, in this period, is really challenged to deal with his agenda, which is now on human rights and restructuring of the country. So this is what King had to say about the Northern freedom movement. And I may point out, he wasn't the only one that made this observation, but this is an interesting observation, and I want your comment on it. Mm-hmm. He said that the Northern freedom movement had been ineffective in nonviolence because it had failed to develop creative tactics. Instead, the Northern nonviolent movement had relied on the mechanical application of nonviolent marches and demonstrations, which became a faint, brief exclamation protest. So he's saying that the Northern movement was basically copying the Southern movement without really doing much to add anything to it and to produce anything. And so the question is, because this is important, because King's moving north. And so if you have any models to draw from of anything that's successful, you'd want to do that. You know what I mean? Because you're coming, as you point out, he knew there were regional differences. So the North is going to have some similarities with the South. The power structure runs the whole country. But the way things work in different parts of the country is different. And so the way and even in the North, there's differences, but definitely North and South. So the question is, do you think that this critique by King was wholly of the Northern movement? And he tried to limit this to 66, 67, but I think it's fair to apply this to the Northern movement period, not just 66 and 67, but 60 on, and not just what's called the civil rights, which we call the Black freedom movement phase, but the Black power phase. And so my question to you is, do you think that King's critique of the Northern movement was wholly or partially correct? And this is important because King has to adjust his Southern model to Northern realities. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I think he's correct because they weren't prepared for the Chicago freedom movement that the SCLC joined in, that coalition in January of '66. These were Southern men, Abernathy and Young and King and others, so much so that these guys didn't even bring a big coat for the winter. And I can relate to that. Here you got educated men with all this learning, and they go to a big city like Chicago in the middle of the winter, and they're not even prepared with a proper coat. I actually did that once when Anderson Thompson at the Carruthers Institute. Then it was the Center for Inner City Studies, And I went, and I wasn't even thinking about it. I'm in California. I'm not even thinking. The brother invites me in to present some of my work. And I'm at the airport. He said, "Where's your jacket?" I said, "Oh, man, I was just trying to get all my stuff together. Didn't even think about it." So I can really relate to people who are not in the kind of cold environment. So they weren't ready. They weren't really prepared. So they get there and they recognize that pretty much, as you said, the demonstrations that can disrupt a community in the South, it doesn't have any it didn't have a major impact in the North. And King recognized that it was all these different institutions. So they began to make adjustments in Chicago as they were learning that these huge slums were a result of. He said, "If you got a slum, you got a slum lord," and he began to recognize that this was a it was a inverse relationship. You can't have one without the other, and they had to make adjustments. So King and his organization started to collect rent for people in these slums. Well, they began to collect rent rather than having them give the rent to the building owner, and so and the force people. But they began to change their strategies as much as they could in Chicago, so they didn't learn. Dr. King thought they can go to Cicero and some of those other communities with this vicious, segregationist white communities. And he said that the people in Mississippi need to come to Chicago to learn how to hate. He said, "I ain't seen so much hate that I've seen here," but they learned a lot. I think King really, that's why I say that he gets his real urban degree when he goes to the North, because they didn't expect all of that. And what happened and worked in the South did not work there. So we recognize that they had to deal with what he called the total chain. He said that we're now addressing, quote, the total chain which enslaves us. That's what he's talking about. And he says that we're here to address the issue of human rights, which is the central question confronting all nations. So King recognized that civil rights focus in the South does not work in the North. He starts talking about human rights. He's dealing with the total chain of all the institutions that enslave Black people. This is why he starts talking about acquiring power. He specifically said he's there to implement Black power. He says that in one of the interviews. So King is really totally correct that what worked in the South doesn't work in the North, and they weren't prepared in January of '66. In fact, when rebellion broke out in '67 there in Chicago, King said they learned quite a lot. They weren't really ready and prepared for that. In the midst of the demonstration, it's the same old issue. The police come out because the children had had the fire hose, fire hose, fire. What do you call it? The fire.
Yeah, I don't know.
Fountain. Yeah, they had it open. There's no pools around, nothing like that. They had it open. It's a hot day in Chicago. The police come, say that's illegal. You need to turn it off, and they get a little bit too aggressive. The community kind of rallies around the people, and next thing you know, police come in, they brutalize some folks, arrest some folks. You got 3 days of rebellion. In the city ends up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring in troops, National Guard, and all of this. But King was not prepared for it at all. But because they hadn't had that direct experience in the South. So he's totally correct in his understanding that they learn critical issues about the real issue about why Black people were in the condition that they were in, because they lacked power and lacked the understanding of the total chain of how everything was interconnected. So this is when King's language changed, his focus changes, and they needed to have a better, more effective strategy. And so in '66, there's no important victories. In '67, there's no important victories. This is why he said, well, look, we need an important victory in order to if this method of nonviolence is going to work. If we're going to solve the problem, we need to find out what the inner core is really like. He said,
The question that I asked you was,
Mhm.
was King correct in his analysis that the Northern movement, prior to him coming there and afterwards, had been ineffective? He said in using nonviolence because it hadn't developed creative tactics. And instead, this movement was relying on a mechanical application of methods used in the South.
Okay.
That's the question.
Okay. No,
But
I think
my question there was,
okay.
do you think he's fully correct in that analysis? And the reason I'm asking this
I don't think
is because when you're moving into a new environment, you want to study what's already going on there, and you want to know what worked and what didn't work there, and so that you don't have to come in cold. And so my question is, was he right in that analysis, partially right or wrong?
No, I don't think he truly understands. I think what he's probably reflecting on in that quote more than anything else is that he and his organization was relying more on a mechanical application of what they did in the South, and not the movement in these areas themselves. I think it's more correct that he and his group needed to be more knowledgeable and more flexible in how they were going to apply what they did in the South. So I think people in the North were more flexible in addressing their particular issues than he and his organization would have been. So I think he's not really correct if he's referring to the movement before they got there. He's only correct when they come and are trying to implement this common strategies that they use in the South. I think that's a more that would be more accurate to say they were more mechanical and not prepared. They had to learn, but folks in the North weren't trying to do what they were doing in the South. He thought that could work in the northern area, but he did learn some things about rent control, a lot of other things that would never didn't come up in the South. So I think that was a part of his education, is to learn, and that's fine. He's only in his mid 30s, mid to late 30s, so he learns as time goes on, and he was a great learner, but that's part of his education. So um, I don't know. Do you have the year that he makes that statement? Because
His statement, he's referring to 66, 67, but that's a statement that I think is appropriate for the Northern movement period, 60 on.
Mhm.
And I'll give my reasons in a minute.
Okay.
Let me give a little response to this, because I thought that observation was very important.
Mhm.
But I want to give a preface to it. In 1965 and 1964, the San Francisco Freedom Movement was engaged in three major campaigns against the hotel and restaurant industry, Auto Row, Bank of America. King comes into San Francisco. I don't remember the exact month, but he comes in to the Cow Palace to have a fundraiser that the Baptist ministers had organized. And he has a meeting with Reverend or Alvin Fine, who was a Jewish religious leader, a rabbi. And was a major leader then. And most of the major leaders in San Francisco opposed the San Francisco Freedom Movement, but supported the Southern movement. And the Baptists who were organizing this fundraiser for King, they had been allied with us. I brought them into an alliance, and then they had betrayed us, but they had produced some results for us in one of our campaigns. So I scheduled a meeting with King. It's the only time I met with him. I had one meeting with Malcolm, one with King. And I was a broke full-time organizer. And this was my 5th year of organizing. I drove my girlfriend's car because I didn't own a car. I bought my clothes at the rich white people's used store in the Pacific Heights. Anybody knows Pacific Heights? That's a rich district in San Francisco. A nice suit for $20, So I had 25 cents in my pocket, and I'm meeting with King, but I have to meet with him in the car. And so the car is driving to the Cow Palace. And so I park my car, get in his car, and my mission is one thing: to get him to endorse the Bank of America campaign. This is the biggest campaign for jobs in the freedom movement, north or south, the biggest bank in the world. And we're at least 4 months into it. So I'm asking him, because him and Abernathy spoke at this rally, and Abernathy gave a better speech than King at this rally, by the way. It was short, it was punchy. And so I told him the background and everything else, and then asked him to endorse it. And he said he would. So then I had to walk, I don't know how many miles back to my car to then drive to the Cow Palace and hear the speech. And when he gave the speech, his reference to the Bank of America campaign was so vague that only he knew what he was talking about. I did too, but nobody else would. And I realized his quandary: he didn't want to offend the ministers. And he knew something about our relationship with the ministers. Now, this is background for saying this. I think King's observation was largely correct. but also incorrect. He's largely correct that the Northern Freedom Movement and the Northern Black Power movement was not successful overall, except for one situation, and then in certain cases, in pieces of situations, not successful in developing a method that worked in the North that could produce victories for Black people on the issues that were central to Black people in the North. And as someone that knows, because basically those movements came out of C.O.R.E. And then you had a few NAACP, Philadelphia, Cecil Moore, who was one of the 4 best leaders of the NAACP. He had campaigns on construction sites. But generally, with a few exceptions, and there were pieces of things that different movements did do that were effective, overall, the Northern Freedom Movement from 60 through the 70s, both through the civil rights and Black Power phase, was ineffective in defeating the power structures in their communities. And King's right when he says that they were playing at some of the things they were doing in the South. And it was a lot of stuff, like in Brooklyn. We had a great chapter in Brooklyn. Anybody from Brooklyn who hears me, they may not like this. And it was one of our best chapters. I led the Black Nationalist Swinging Corps. They were supportive of me, and I really liked them. G2 Weusi, one of my best friends, his skills were shaped there. But essentially, they had more symbolic protests, like tying up the freeway to the World's Fair. You know what I mean? And it was a lot of stuff like that, or sitting in at construction sites for jobs. And that was important. But as a strategist, I'd have never done that. And I'll explain this in a minute. But then we had like Cleveland Corps had one of, next to San Francisco Corps was our best chapter. And they produced some things in economic development later. And they laid a foundation for the election of Carl Stokes as mayor, the first Black mayor of that period. And that was one of the things that King referred to in how Blacks could exercise power. So that was one of our best chapters. But he was right overall, but wrong in that the one movement that was successful was the San Francisco Freedom Movement. We're the only movement that successfully defeated an entire economic power structure. And we entered the same way he did, not knowing how to build power. So we had to learn on the spot. But we literally defeated all employers. I think one of King's mistakes when he went into Chicago was not to have a focus on the central issue that were key to Blacks. He made the mistake of having demonstrations. He was using the demonstration strategy, taking it to the suburbs. That's about as bad a move as you can make. And then realizing how racist they were. He was surprised. You know what I mean? More than Mississippi. He was surprised. But what could you accomplish through demonstrations in the suburbs? Nothing. But that was importing or exporting the march model. And so what we found in the San Francisco Freedom Movement was that we didn't have a model. We had to come up with our own. So we didn't make the mistake of trying to imitate the Southern movement. We respected it. And in a few cases, we learned some things from them. But basically, we had to suit a model for our circumstance. And so as a result of that, for example, we didn't use the march. King was talking about how the march was used, and it was used symbolically, and he's correct with a lot of these movements. They had the marches to do what? We had an economic movement to begin with. And marches don't work in economic movements. You know what I mean? Yeah, I mean, what are you going to do with a march and you're going up against entrenched power structures? You've got to hurt them financially. Now, his idea of a boycott is one. We used the boycott and we had the church, but the boycott only worked under certain circumstances. We took on the Bank of America. The boycott wouldn't work. The biggest bank in the world, all Blacks could withdraw their money from the bank. It wouldn't have put a dent in them. And I won't tell you the strategy we used there. It was so sophisticated that, we had the bank defeated after we had a 3-month negotiation strategy, and then it was demonstration. So the key point is that we understood that while we could learn from the South, and the South was the motor for us, no Southern movement, no Northern movement. They drove us. That was the basis. But in our circumstance, we had to discover our own conditions. Boycotts. Boycotts could work under certain circumstances. Like we had a boycott on the supermarkets, chains all over the Bay Area. Those are the best jobs we produced. But since a lot of customers in San Francisco were white, they didn't observe it. So on the spot, we came up with another strategy that worked. And that strategy nearly put the supermarkets out of business. We got the best job. All the jobs we produced in 63 and 64 are still there for Black people today. Brown, red, and yellow. And they had no jobs before that. And we took none of them. So we defeated an entrenched power structure. Had King looked at our model, because I knew that he had a boycott model, Operation Breadbasket. But this was more comprehensive, because how you defeat an entrenched economic power structure in the urban North requires different strategies and different tactics. He was dealing with the daily machine, for example. We didn't have
Let me ask you this. So when King is talking about, the Northern movement, because he only worked in the South and the northern city like Chicago. He never worked in the West. So, he never had a campaign where he was operating, here in the West Coast. So, so I know when he's referring to the North, he's really referring to those northern cities, and because you're referring to the important success here on the West Coast. I know he's focusing on the North.
I'm referring to the only success where a power structure was taken down in the North period. North, the East Coast, Midwest, or West Coast. I'm referring to all of them. This is the only one. Okay. And it was comprehensive. So what I'm saying is, and it's not a secret, because like we're in the press 5 days a week for 6 years, you know what I mean? And we had failures, because before we got to the economic part, we dealt with what he tried to deal with in Chicago, education. It didn't go anywhere, you know what I mean? We had a Operation Fair Rental, which was successful. I led that as chair of the housing committee. That just got you listings so you could rent anywhere you wanted to. You get the listings, whether you got the rent was somewhere else. And they had that. But the key point is, we learned that we had to follow what people wanted. In the South, it was successful in part because they were dealing with the people's issue. It was segregation, the right to vote. That's what people would tell you they wanted. And in the North, and this was true of the whole North, the main issue was economic. And that's the one you could win on if you approached it right. We didn't take on unions, for example. I saw his analysis on unions, because unions are hard to beat. We took on the employers that we could put out of business, and then, encourage unionization, or some of them were unionized, like the supermarket. They were unionized, but it wasn't the union we were taking on. It was the economic entity. So what I'm saying is, King was probably not aware of this, but the key point is, it was an urban strategy. And King is in Chicago. Chicago is a machine. It was a daily machine. The Irish ran it. It was block organizing. King talking about how to build power. In Chicago, if you're going to build power, economics is a key thing to take on, and you can win on that with the right alliances and coalitions, right organizing strategy. But the real power in Chicago that Blacks have never realized is organizing the blocks. And that's what the Irish control. And so when King goes to Chicago, he's dealing with the Irishmen daily. And then when he sends in Jesse later to get rid of him, because he sent Jesse into Chicago to get rid of him. There were a lot of reasons for that. And when Daley meets with Jesse, he gives Jesse an offer of a job to be a block organizer. And that was a pure insult to Jesse. Jesse gets the Black middle class in Chicago to fund him, rich Blacks and Ebony Magazine. And that becomes his base.
Yes. So let me ask you this, Doc.
Well, hold on.
Okay. All right.
In San Francisco, we organized the blocks. And if you want to talk about where real power is, it's the blocks. Now it's harder, because we've got broken communities. So it depends on the community you're organizing. You're probably organizing pockets in some, but in others, you still have about 76 Black cities that are predominantly Black, and Chicago is still one of them, over 600,000 Black people in the Black community of Chicago. And I was pushing when Harold Washington was elected mayor, organize the blocks, because you now have that momentum coming from the top. So what I'm saying is that in the urban strategy required a different set of strategies and organizing approaches than the Southern one, though some of the Southern methods could work. For example, we formed a Black United Front, the United Freedom Movement. Will Usry went to Birmingham. And by the way, Will was chair before me. He was interviewed by King to be his executive director. He didn't pick him. He wasn't going to, because he's going to pick a minister, you know. But Will's very smart. He was chair before me. He ended up being National Action Council chair, highest office in C.O.R.E, elected office. Will went there to study the Birmingham campaign. And he came back recommending we build a united front, which they didn't have, though they had a coalition of groups in Birmingham. But what he wanted to do was use King's method of confrontation, confronting the power structure, the economic, the political, the educational, the police, the whole broad spectrum. Because King did that in Birmingham, but he had learned from Albany he needed a leverage, and the leverage was the boycott. He put some boycott on businesses. I told him that ain't going to work. You cannot confront a whole power structure. It's divide and conquer. Hit them in their weak spot. So when it didn't work, that's what we did. So what I'm saying is, and there were other things that we did as well. It was a whole city of organizing. You know what I mean? Organizing a whole city. Block organizing, 45,000 Black people. That's the Fillmore. We organized. So what I'm saying is King was right that in the North, largely, we didn't have a method that worked. Some of our people were intellectualizing it. Some of them were engaged in demonstrations and meant well, but they didn't have a systematic approach. San Francisco Freedom Movement did. It's still a model. And had King drawn from it, it would have given him some answers and would have given him some victories, significant victories across the board. So that's my point. You got any?
Yeah. So in the one of the things about the North, and you mentioned Stokes, and there were other mayors and Gary and other places, and this is, it's right in that period in '67, and even in Richmond, California, you have the Black mayors. So you have Black people that are, for the very first time, they're able to at least yield some organization enough to be able to elect the first Black mayors in these urban cities, which had not been done before. So would you see that as some success in being able to deal with the power struggle? Because obviously to deny Black people the right to vote is about having, the white power structure continue to totally control Black community in the entire cities. But now you have the election of Black mayors. It's not like that's a panacea for everything, but it is a breakthrough in the sense that this had not been done before. But do you see that as some success or not any success at all, since this was a new phenomena that was occurring in those northern cities that clearly how do you see that in terms of progress and significant movement forward?
Carl Stokes was a victory. That was C.O.R.E, Cleveland C.O.R.E behind it. But it was also a problem. And then what would happen later would become the big problem. Because on the one hand, Blacks had a right to move to control urban centers in which they were a majority or had a large number. And so that was a move that Blacks wanted, and it was a correct move. However, the Ford Foundation had a strategy in that direction. And that strategy was to replace militant leadership that had come out of Black Freedom and Black Power movement and Black Panther movement by then with moderate leaders. And while Bobby Seale ran for mayor in Oakland and could have been elected had he run a second time, and it would have been a good move. Bobby's good organizer and would have produced for the Black community. Various things prevented that from happening. But by and large, while it was a good move, It was a co-opted move because in the majority of cases, the mayors who became Black mayors of urban centers had no movement experience, and that included Oakland, where you had Judge Lionel Wilson serving for years, who didn't do nothing for Black people. And then, and others who came after him. And it sets it up for Governor Brown to move on the Black establishment when he becomes mayor, because he's using it as a springboard to become governor again. And he has an agenda to destroy the Black establishment in Oakland and to bring in, he starts with 100,000 whites through condemning Black properties and Black businesses and everything else. But had those mayors produced something, they would have had a power base. So it was a good move. And in the case of someone like Harold Washington, it was a great move because he produced for his city. Or in the case of Newark, Amiri Baraka's son doing good work in Newark. So, you have, or in Mississippi, you got a Black mayor in Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Lumumba's son, doing good work. But in most cases, those mayors were out to lunch, including Mayor Bradley from Los Angeles, who lost the governor's race because he didn't do the work in mobilizing Black voters, an ex-cop, you know what I mean? So it's a mixed blessing. It was a mixed blessing. Had we been able to put our people in there, it could have produced something with an organizational base underneath them. Now, let's talk about Black Power and its origin and meaning and King's response to it. We have two questions. This and the last one will be finished. Let's talk about Black Power, its origin and meaning and King's response to it. What was the impact of Black Power on the overall Black liberation movement? What were its strengths, Black Power, its strengths and weaknesses?
King lays it out pretty well. I think King is far more balanced than the younger activist in understanding that, because he's reflective about the whole thing. Well, S.N.C.C had a slogan, Black Power for Black People. This is the slogan that S.N.C.C used. And then Brother Mukasa Dada, Willie Ricks, he shortened it to just Black Power. And he strategized with Stokely Carmichael and said, "Hey man, Stokely, we need to drop it, man. We need to drop it." So in the Meredith March Against Fear, they decided around June 16th of 1966 to start to introduce that term Black Power. And King was not for it at first, but along that march, King is also starting to call for Black Power. He said, if we had power, they wouldn't be doing this to us. If we had power, we'd be able to do this. And you can see footage of Dr. King speaking now more and more about Black Power. You see a reporter, they're walking down the highway. Stokely Carmichael's on one side, King's on the other, and the reporter's going back and forth. What do you think? What do you think? You can see that they're actually working it out during the march, the Meredith March Against Fear in 66. And so when the movement burst on the scene, then it was a clear split. It was the young activists in S.N.C.C, the young activists in C.O.R.E. It was all of SCLC. They embraced the Black Power movement. Whereas others like John Lewis, he left his own organization. He was not for that. NAACP pulled out. All white activists was told, you got to go. This is our struggle. So clearly, when the movement burst on the scene, and the first time that is introduced in the movement, the term Black Power in June of 66, it burst on the scene. It was a clear split between those that were radicalizing the movement and those that wanted to stay more conservative. And King's criticism was that you all are just talking about a slogan and not a program. King also said that the one problem he had with Black Power initially, he changed, but initially is that it sounded too much like white power. And he thought that would be used by the media and the white public against Black people in the Black freedom movement. So King had some issues there, but he never condemned them. He was just giving some balanced criticism that it needs to be a program. So the limitations is that S.N.C.C did not develop a program around. So, Brother Stokely and others, they were lecturing about Black Power. And King said, you need to be more focused on a program. And so they were back and forth about it. But ultimately, King embraces Black Power as a program. He discusses it. He promotes it. He writes Black Power Defined. You can see in his book, he's got a whole section on Black Power. But he thought that the slogan itself would give an opening to the enemies of Black people to use brutality against black people, and he thought that that was a weakness. He also thought another weakness would be that people were too focused on the program. I mean, they weren't focused on a program and more on a slogan. And certainly the SNCC programs that had been working very well did dry up. They lost funding. They lost a lot of support, and they were, lecturing and not the local organizers that SNCC had become so adept at. So King was right on most of his analysis of it, and so there were strengths and weaknesses. But I think ultimately the young activists were correct. King embraced them, King protected them, and King separated himself from those that publicly came out to condemn Black Power. Back in October of 1966, um, Rustin and other folks, they issued a press statement in October to condemn Black Power, and they tried to link King into that condemnation. One of the reporters said, "What does Dr. King think about this?" Dr. King said, yeah, with Dr. King, he agrees. So King was upset that they tried to link him to the anti-Black Power position. So that was October 14th, 66. 3 days later, King took out an ad in the New York Times, and he clarified his own stand, said he did not condemn Black Power, that this was a real legitimate expression of Black anger and disappointment that the country is not moved to embrace Black people. And he and behind the scenes, what King said, this wasn't in the media, but behind the scenes, King called these folks Mickey Mouse Negroes. That's exactly his term, quote unquote. He was not going to work with them. And that's when he decided to split with the Rustins and others who tried to pull him into an anti-Black Power statement. So King then became more and more embracing of Black Power, not just as a program, but even the slogan itself. And that's why he writes definitively of how we can implement, as he saw it, how Black Power could be implemented itself. But that was the weakness. It just started off as a slogan and not a campaign to really get concrete results. And I think King's analysis on that is pretty on target. So that's what I would share.
Yeah, that's important because he was pulled in a lot of different directions, was afraid that he would lose some of his support around Black Power. But because King respected the truths that came out of the movement, and people like Kwame Ture, Kwame wasn't young enough to be his son, but King was the elder, and King respected him. You know what I mean? And respected SNCC. So yeah, that's important. And King was correct that the weakness of Black Power is that it was a slogan. The strength is that it was the result of the awakening that had come from the young activists in the movement, and which had started, I say, in 63, and then had reached its fruition 65 and 66, because we came in following the elders, and then we came up with our own analysis. And Black nationalism was a key part of that, and Black Power was an expression. And so King, while he had reservations, as you say, he didn't put it down. He was critical, but he also embraced the parts that he could identify with. Now, I've said this before, but this is new information, so I'm going to share this again. Kwame Ture is a friend of mine, so he stayed at my house, Stokely, Carmichael, and we put security on him. He liked the ladies, so he didn't like the security, but he got the security because I told him, ain't nobody shooting you on our watch. And we have martial artists and people trained and shit. So you ain't going nowhere unless you're covered. So, and then, we talk. So he told me, well, when they're doing this march against fear, the Meredith March, and so they're up speaking at night in Mississippi, and Willie Ricks whispers in his ear. He says, "Say Black Power, say Black Power." Kwame told me this. This is what Kwame said. He said, "Yeah, he told me to do that, but Willie Ricks kind of crazy. I didn't know if I should do it." And then he did it. And then Black Power was everywhere. It's going to catch your mama, your father, your sister, and your brother. You know what I mean? That became the thing. But this is what's not commonly known. And every time I met with Kwame, I forgot to tell him. And there's a picture, if you look at one of the shows I did on my book, Return to the African Mother Principle, Male and Female Equality, It's me and him talking in Memphis, Tennessee. That was 1995, shortly before, or maybe the early phase of him getting cancer. Again, I forgot to tell him. And so what was this? I've told some of you this before, but most of you don't know this. And it's in no books. I have a friend named Paulu. Paulu has since passed. He was from Bahamas. He had a PhD in a special kind of building engineering, where you take the materials in a rural area and use it to build that rural area. And he was all over the world. He was a principal organizer of the Sixth Pan-African Congress, organized people from the South Pacific all over. He was a minister of parliament until he cussed out the Queen and they kicked him out of the parliament. That's what he was like. And then when he was traveling, he was somebody that did stitching, needle stitching. So when he'd come to my house, I'd always get a sweater. You know what I mean? I got a couple of sweaters that he needle stitched. And somebody said, well, he must be gay because he's doing that. And he had babies all over the world. So Caribbean man, you know what I mean? So he's telling me that when he was going to college in Southern California, he met Malcolm, you know? And then when he's in Africa in 1964, he sees Malcolm as Malcolm is on his sojourn. And Malcolm tells him this. This is what Kwame Ture didn't know, and no one in the movement knows. Malcolm says, Adam Clayton Powell and I, we're calling a Black Power conference at Howard University. Do you want to come? He said, no, he couldn't come. Well, when Willie Ricks calls and tells, Kwame Ture whispers in his ear, say Black Power, he heard that from Adam Clayton Powell at the conference held at Howard. Malcolm was behind that. Everybody knows his spirit was behind Black Power. Transformation of the movement consciously that occurred through battles and Malcolm's influence. So that's a little side story there. The ghost of Malcolm was all up in it because if him and Adam collaborated, you know where the idea came from? It came from Malcolm. You know what I mean? And they were close. And by the way, there's a film that is on called Godfather of Harlem. You should watch that. And they got a lot of stuff where they're putting Adam Clayton Powell and Malcolm together. And the brother who's playing a big part in seeing that kind of information gets out there, James Smalls. Smalls is the advisor to that show. You should check that show out. This is the final question, and then we're finished. You discussed this the last time, so I want to put a new twist on this one. So King, by the end of by 65, is talking about it's a human rights struggle, it's not a civil rights struggle. And he's talking about the need to restructure America. You can give some brief points on what King meant by that, but also your ideas on what you think we can draw from our own history and culture, African and African American, that can also aid in those ideas of restructuring to eliminate poverty and oppression in this country and around the world.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I just want to make one brief thing. Yeah, just like you mentioned in terms of the roots of Black Power, we can also add the labor, the rent work in New York, where Black Power was used. I was simply referring strictly to the first time the slogan had been introduced in a campaign. But you're right, it has roots to it before that. Even Richard Wright discussed and wrote about Black Power before that. But in terms of introducing it in the movement, that's where the June of '66 comes in. Well, I think what we can do is certainly learn from the organizing strategies, the success, and really build on it. A lot of people, they just don't necessarily get the benefit of knowing about this because it's the focus on individuals and not organizations. And that gets missed from Montgomery and every campaign. People focus on Rosa Parks as opposed to the fact that she was a legal secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery and the Women's Political Council and other organizations that are much more important than the individuals that produce them. And that's one of the things that Kwame Ture always focused on, is that it's the organizations that produces the leaders and that's what we should really recognize. So I think for us right now is to try to, like a lot of the protests, they're not really linked to more comprehensive approaches. There's just protests in the street that are not well thought out because, the anarchists come in and they disrupt the Black Lives Matter protests, and people are begging and pleading to respect the family. Everybody go home. They don't understand. It's not about that. It's about people coming in to disrupt what Black folks are doing, and we're just not learning enough from those strategies in the past. There needs to be some enforcers to make sure that any kind of organizing efforts or just demonstrations are protected, but they have to be linked to more sustainable programs, such as the economic components and the political component. So I think that reading King's book, a where do we go from here? He lays out some important strategies that are still valuable today because it's a comprehensive assessment of how do we use the different intersections of different components to move our agenda forward. So this is why he's looking at labor and politics and economic, the social environment, the church. He's looking at so many different elements and aspects and list them and how we can move forward. And I do think, and even now, there's some useful insight that could be used at least as a general guideline. So for me, it's to look at the growth of King in the first to the second period, the growth of Malcolm to the second period, but also the political maturity, that Black folks had undergone, even with the election of mayors. We know that that's limited if we only look at that, but it's something that had not been done before, and so it was to try to implement part of what the movement was focused on. So for me, it's really to look and see what were the strategies and principles used, and what were the successful organizing principles that organizations such as what you were in, SNCC, and C.O.R.E, and the other successes of the organization. So to me, SNCC, C.O.R.E, SCLC, to me, they provide the base, and of course the Black Panther Party here, the Black Panther Party for self-defense, important lessons of how they got street lights changed and forced local businesses that you're going to contribute to the community, and free breakfast and nutrition and healthcare screening. So I think it's to look at not the nostalgia of these parties, and but really what were the practical successful measures and practices that they've laid for us. To me, that's one of the most significant approaches that we should take. And it's tough to really bridge the gap between the young people now who don't even see the need. Not all of them, but there's a good number of them that don't see the need to study and learn and benefit from this because they think that, quote unquote, nobody did anything. And I hear that very often from people who are out on the front lines. No, it ain't so much that anybody did anything. They haven't read anything, nor have they respected elders who are right here in the Bay Area and around the country that have important guidance. Well, people didn't even know Mukasa Dada or Willie Ricks. He had to tell them at one of the Atlanta rallies a year and a half ago. He said, "Google me, look me up." And oh man, you were associated with Black Power. He's right there in Atlanta. He was out there protesting with them, and these folks had never even heard of the brothers. So this is what happens too often: is that we got brothers like yourself and sisters, organizers that are here, that are still, clear about what happened, that can be great models and great examples that are not utilized. So to me, that's what has to be done, along with understanding the significance of the organizations and not simply the individuals to really help us to move forward. And that's, just some general things I would say, but we lack that intergenerational. And I've never seen and I've never studied a time period where we're at now where you have such a rift between the younger generation. At least with King and the younger brothers and sisters, there was communication, there was collaboration, there was coordination. Even though they might have had a slightly different strategy or approach, but they worked together. Now you got folks that don't even want to hear, literally don't even want to hear or communicate with elders who will guide them. And I can point out some sharp young people that will be in contact us with some things, but when it comes to organizing, they can't be seen associated with anybody that might even have a person that they may know in the police force because they will be ridiculed by their colleagues. So they're not leading to teach young folks. You cannot categorize everybody in the same boat. So all parents are not the same, all teachers are not the same, all police are not the same. We have people inside, they may not have been making the greatest changes inside, but they are inside and working in their best interest to help the people in our community. And a lot of young folks that I've seen, very good, or not seen, but been in touch with, that are not at that point. So to me, that's what I would say is what we can do to move forward, so that the reflection is a practical reflection that we can build on moving forward in the future.
Manu, your comments have been very valuable. I've tried to cut my show to 2 hours, but when we have serious discussions like this, which we did on the assassination of Malcolm, and we also did on your discussion of the revolutionary Martin Luther King, we go longer because depth is required. I want to say a couple of things in closing this, and then you can make final statements. Reading is leading. If you don't read, you can't lead. And I'm talking about lead yourself, let alone any kind of movement. One of the reasons that we have this disrespect, serious generational disrespect, is I've discussed this in depth before, and it's in my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. Since King's assassination, it didn't have to do with King's assassination, just the time happened to hit. Certain forces hit us. The second post-Reconstruction, I talked about it last week, where the move of the system is to take back the gains we had made in the second Reconstruction, starting in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. But also the shift of jobs overseas, that breaks up families. It does more, the loss of good manufacturing and good paying jobs, union jobs that go overseas, does more to break up Black families than anything. Drugs in the Black community, breaking up Black communities, a host of things. It creates what God told me is a choice between two cultures. So we're stepping out of culture now, like we've never done before. And disrespect of elders is just one indicator.
Right.
It's just one indicator. And if you are raised in a situation where you've never seen a man, a father figure, then that's going to affect how you view not only other fathers, but elders in general. And so, and that's a key institution we carried from Africa, the institution of elderhood. But there's a host of other things. So that is a important thing. Now, on the question of King's restructuring of the country, King was talking about capitalism's no good. And he was right. And as Manu points out in his writings, and he said before, King had this idea even before he joined the movement. He agreed that Marx was right on the corruption of capitalism, but he didn't embrace Marxism for a variety of reasons. So King was talking about a restructuring that ended poverty. I don't know how you're going to end racism, but we'll reduce it, put it in a bag, or do something. But the key point is he learned that in part through the injustices occurring in this country and internationally. And so, and he was showing how racism is linked to capitalism and caused this. Now, what I would add to this is this, and I would agree, and this is a key point with King and Malcolm that we shouldn't miss. Historically, I've said this before, I want to really drive this home because a lot of us only think short term. We're not thinking long term, and we got to do both. Deal with the immediate and address immediate problems that face us, but then also deal with the long-term solutions. And what had happened between King and Malcolm had never happened before. That is a convergence of two wings of the struggle that have been characterized as integration and Black nationalism, that have been characterized. King and Malcolm came to agreement that what needed to happen is this place needs to be restructured. I've gone through his chicken with the duck egg analogy before. And King had reached the same conclusion. So that means there's a convergence of agreement. And for those that want to go back to Africa, which was me, I thought a lot of us would go. You got a right to. And some have. That's good. But the majority of our people are not. So what are we going to do for them? And that means the society has to be transformed. So, and that's restructured. And so one of the things I'd add to this, you've seen me at it before, but I want to give you a formula that helps because I'm practical. I've never lost a battle. I come out of winning movements. My thoughts work. You know what I mean? And so this is a suggestion. What we need to do is to shape institutions. We need to shape practices that help us restructure now so that we can use it in our lives today and work the kinks out of it so that we can apply it in the broader society. So, for example, on the question of capitalism, we need to revisit communalism. And I don't think that's something that King looked a lot at. He looked at socialism, particularly in Europe, the Swedish model and stuff like that. But we need to be looking at our communal model, which is built into our culture, which is a communal ethos of caring and sharing. And that needs to be worked out in cooperatives and various things that I know King supported and Malcolm supported, and we should support. So that's one. On the teaching model, we have a methodology that is Eurocentric and information that's Afrocentric. We got to change the methodology. So we be what we learn. You know, I'm working on that. In terms of awakening, we have to institutionalize the process for awakening so that we can get to our young people and help them. And those that have undergone awakening can exchange it with those that haven't. And the key objective there is love, which is key in our culture and key for humanity, self-love. So what I'm saying is restructuring doesn't just require dismantling of a system and replacing it with another, but it requires putting in place models now that we can use in our own life and then be applied later on. And that is a part of a restructuring model that can work as we build the power to implement it. You got anything else you want to say? Finally, we wrap up.
I would say that it's more important for us to look at Dr. King's death day on April 4th than his birthday on January 15th because he's important not because he was a little cuddly baby born in Atlanta, black baby born in Atlanta in 1929, but it's to shift our gaze from the birthday to the death day to look at the uncomfortable image of Dr. King lying in the pool of his own blood because what he we need to know and look at what he lived for and what he died for, which is far more important than his birthday. So we have to shift our gaze and really move away from this propaganda of the dream and look at him as a practical organizer if we're going to really make the assessment of King real and relevant. So that's my challenge to the public in general, is not get caught up in a birthday celebration because King on his own birthday was organizing. He spent hours organizing what would have been his biggest campaign, and so we should follow in that tradition and really look at what he lived for and what he ultimately died for. I mean, that's what Christians do with Jesus. They look at his life and what he died for, and we should look at that same approach and take the same approach regarding Dr. King. So that's what I would say. They can go to my website, manuampim.com. I have a couple articles up on King, but my greatest work on the revolutionary Dr. King, that will be one of my future book projects.
Yeah, that one needs to come out. That
Yes,
one
sir.
needs to come out.
Yes, sir.
Uh-huh.
Yes, sir.
I know you got a lot of things to do, but
Yeah.
you're on that one, brother.
Yes, sir. You know what? I believe the greatest work is still ahead of me, and so I'm
I
gonna
am.
keep that on the agenda, and and ultimately make my mother and proud of the ongoing work. But I appreciate the discussion today, and hopefully, your audience got some more um, important material that they can use and move forward. Because one who learns teaches, and what Kwame Ture would always tell us is that the purpose of information is to clarify the work that has to be done anyway. So hopefully, we've done that with this program today.
Yeah, good. Yeah, your comments have been great, and we really respect them and appreciate them. I want to see, there's a few points here. there were one or two questions that I thought were important. Okay, JB, this is what we were missing, Generation X. How can the elders get respect to their friends and we cannot give respect to our parents? You want to make a comment on that?
Respect to the friends, but not to the parent. Can you read that again? How could?
This is what we're missing in Generation X. How can the elders get respect to their friends? I think he means from their friends when we cannot give respect to our parents.
Well, it needs to be respect all the way around. I mean, we've always respected elders in our tradition. Even older people who were drunkards, and even then we would give them some respect, and they would not get the deference of a respected elder, but we never disrespected those that were older. So, you know, I think it's a return to our cultural traditions, and that's the way to do that is return to our cultural traditions, and then it would be quite easy or much easier to respect elders and respect anyone who's older than us, and we give them the that level of respect. That's important. I've written an essay series on the five major African initiation rites. So you have, respected elders that are just that. They should be respected as elders, and they're not just older people, but they are in fact elders. So it has to be an overall respect for the community in general, and that would allow us to respect elders and friends and everybody else. But we also must demonstrate respectful behavior at the same time. You don't just get respect just because you want it. You get respect because it's earned, and that's what we have to do is embrace our own value system and not deal with the warped value system of the general American public, because that has never been a system that has respected elders. That's not a part of the European tradition. Their tradition is to do something new and innovative and dismiss everybody that came before you, and just and warehouse elders or older people as they've seen them, because that's not surprising. I mean, clearly, it's a warrior, strongman tradition whereby they didn't farm. So the most valuable member in these early European societies were the young male warrior, who was the most strongest and agile. And anybody who was not in that group, whether they are the elder people, the women, the children, they weren't given the same level of respect. And that's what we see today, is a continuation of this kind of value system where the young male warrior, the most agile and strongest males, are the most valuable, not elders, not women, not children. So it's not difficult to see how this low level value system has become a part of the American framework. So we can't do well if we continue to, or in any way, embrace this kind of ridiculous value system. We must respect those who know, and that is the elders.
There's another question here, Manu. Uh, so great work, gentlemen. Again, great work. My question is knowing we have organizations doing very good work with and for our people, but do you think we need another king or X or entity to lead us? What's your view on that?
Well, it's kind of what I was sharing earlier, is that the problem is people wait on big time, big name leaders to save us. There's no one coming to save us. We always have leaders, but those leaders are produced by the movements themselves. We can't wait on individuals to, or leaders to come organize us. It's the organization itself that produces leaders. That's one of the points that Kwame Ture made on a regular basis. So people are waiting on a Rosa Parks or a King or a Malcolm. This is an error. This is a mistake. Anybody can lead. Anybody can serve by just being active, and that's one of the things that I honor in my family. My mother is. Um, you wouldn't know Miss Rosie Jones necessarily, but there was many people influenced by her. You know why? Because she served. She simply served others, and that's what people need to do. We don't need the big time leader to save us. Those leaders, people with skills, they will, they exist. They're around. We may not know about them because, the movement just has not got to where it has put these people in a prominent light. But we don't need the big leaders to get work done and to begin solving problems. Leaders will emerge in the process. And so I think that's one of the things that the movement has taught us. And King is a perfect example, is that He was not someone who sought the limelight at all. He was produced by that movement and pushed forward by many others, and he finally embraced his own mission. So that's what I would say is that forget the big leader model. You know, leaders are great, but that's not required to serve, and that's not required to solve our problems. Leaders will emerge from the overall collective work and effort. So that's what we should be doing. What can we do in our own realm, in our own space, to begin to address and solve problems? Period.
Yeah, and I would agree with that and say that 68 is King's assassination, but it's also a transition point for Black people in another way. 65 was transformation from civil rights to something else. But 68 is where our communities get heavily hit and produce what I call this choice between two cultures. We created culture before and still are, but since then, it's put us in a position of choosing between our own culture and this mad one and not being conscious of the choices we're making, at least where they're coming from. And the breakdown of institutions, starting with the family, where we go from 75% two-parent households to 29% today, uh, and the breakdown of other institutions is indicative of the fact that I think we're past the era of the single charismatic leader. There may be people around who have a message that's important and they're good speakers and we should listen to them. And they may play a role in movements, but movements can't spin around that. One, because no single leader's got the answers. This is too complex. Two, because if they're successful in building a movement, they're going to get knocked off. You know, that's just the nature of how this system works. So you got to multiply leadership and multiply power. And this requires a different approach to leadership that's more collective. And this is where I think the younger generation has got a message. Black Lives Matter is using the Ella Baker model. That model is suited for today. It doesn't mean that there's no role for good speakers, but do not center your movement around a message, center around a program. And programs are complex. It takes a lot of people to put them together. You know. Anything else you want to add? Because this is it.
That's pretty much it. You know, let's embrace the real king, king the activist, and not king the myth. Otherwise, it's following the propaganda direction that has been perpetuated by biographers and the journal media. So that's what I would say. So folks can check me out. I'm on social media. Go to any of Facebook or anywhere else you can find me. ManuAmpim.com to know some of my ongoing work. So I appreciate it, Brother T'Shaka, for opportunity to share some of what I know about one of the greatest organizers in the 20th century. So I'll continue to advance his work as I move forward, and will eventually publish the book on the revolutionary Dr. King.
You better, brother.
Yes.
You know, I love you, brother. And
Yeah,
you're
I love you too.
you're one beautiful brother.
So
And
thank you, sir.
it makes my life worthwhile to be around brothers and sisters like you, smart, conscious, hardworking, and their whole agenda is our people. You know what I mean? So I know
Thank
people
you.
appreciated what you had to say. And again, we extend our condolences on the loss of your mother. The only good thing you can say about that is she's in a good place. She was in a good place here.
Mhm.
She had a great son, great family, but you know, she's in another place now, and we honor her and respect your work. Keep up the good work, brother.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. All right. Thank you.
Hotep to everybody.
All right. Hotep to the family.